Chapter 673. The same story, when told by different people, would naturally have a completely different plot structure and melodramatic creation. The most secretive and, in fact, most influential story at the end of the 36 constitutional calendars was no exception in this regard. The great teacher from the Empire arrived at the Federation at the same time as the research spaceship of the Federation, or even earlier. From then on, countless magnificent, melodramatic, messy, tear-streaked, and crazy scenes were created. The genius master named Huajieyu was one of the genius students, Fengyu. Of course, he was probably not named Fengyu. He never mentioned these things to the ignorant apprentices beside the mine, but Sulu once heard Hui Chaosher mention some memory fragments. The white-clothed, bare-legged artistic figure also told this story. Whether it was the princess of the empire or the great teacher, the angle they chose to tell this story was naturally completely different from the main character of today's story. The following was the story told by the most famous student of the former master of the empire, Fan Huajieyu, and also the most hated man in the empire. He was also the most irreplaceable military god of the Federation, Li Pifu. At that time we were still very young. We didn't know which space that black-haired, black-eyed young man who was not much older than us fell from. We only knew that he taught us some very strange things, and then we found out that he was actually from the Empire. What is the Empire? When the research spaceship of the Federation was blown to pieces by the cannons of the Empire. Because of political reasons we didn't know. Even if we did, we were still young and couldn't have too much hatred for the Empire. Being too young is not an excuse but a fact. Speaking of which, I have to mention another student of my teacher. He is my brother, your teacher. You are used to calling him uncle, but you should know that he has many identities. In fact, just like me, who is about to be engraved on a tombstone for people to consume, his name is not very important. As for me, I still call him Li Pifu, just like when I was young I always call him Li Yu. After talking about Li Yu, let's go back to this era. A story so long ago that even I feel that it is a bit vague. It seemed to him that our teacher was a pacifist traveler, who had taken a fanciful trip to the stars out of curiosity. I admit I was curious but not pacifist, especially when many years later, I learned that the seed plan had come from his brain. I don't know how many years my teacher traveled in the Federation, how many places he went, how many people he met, why he stayed in the wildlife sanctuary in Philadelphia and taught us for so many years. I only know that he lived a good life in those years. I even forgot that he was from the Empire. However, the war still broke out in the end. Teacher took us to the Empire in a spaceship, and we spent a very strange time in the Empire. In fact, I have to admit that in the future battles, the 17th Division would be able to achieve more feats than the other Federation troops, and this is all thanks to this. I have been to the Empire and I know about the Empire. My teacher taught me many things about the Empire. There was one more thing that he had to admit. In the Federation in the future, Liu was able to successfully develop the blue light instrument that his teacher had first proposed, and finally successfully use the spaceship's reference chip to successfully create the camouflage chip, all because of his teacher's teachings. But we are from the Federation. The Federation and the Empire are at war. We are orphans in the Empire, and if we leave we are also orphans wandering the universe. I don't like wandering, I don't like the Empire. There is only love and hate when there is comparison. When you live in the Federation and the Empire, you should know very well which side is more suitable for human life. But my brother is different. He can't find a home for himself. An ideal place that doesn't even exist. He loathes Charter for watching his every move. He loathes those families hidden behind the history of the Federation. He is too conceited and even a little narcissistic. He thinks that he can change some of this. He was a genius. He solved the problems that my teacher couldn't solve. He didn't need to pretend to be a returnee from Bermuda. He could play any role he wanted. But at that time the conflict didn't escalate because it was only a difference in philosophy. It didn't involve something as important as life and death. Schiller once said that in this world, other than life and death, everything else is irrelevant. I lived for 88 years before I gradually understood the true meaning of this sentence. The story became more and more intense. It was also a story of life and death. Where should this story begin? It should start from when I returned to the Federation. As I said before, I am from the Federation. The Federation is at war with the Empire. What choice should a person from the Federation make? The precious selenium-rich hot spring water from the foothills of Feiqing City flowed slowly through the natural water pipe made of old bamboo, through the rice paddies and the fish ponds. It passed through the green walls of the courtyard and quietly entered from the corner of the eaves. It then converged into the 7 or 8 square meters coarse stone pool. The hot steam flowed slowly like a white dragon, rising from all directions and filling the room with blurred vision. It was like the so-called truth from many years ago. There were very few people who were qualified to enter this manor by the lake of Feiqing City. Over the years, only the Madam of Macho Back Mountain was qualified to enter this manor. But that madam must have taken off her clothes and entered the bath naked. Therefore, thinking that he was the only one who had the honor to enter this pool, Sulu began to feel a little nervous. As a person from the Federation, it was an honor to be able to share a hot spring with the military god. An ordinary military green towel was tightly wrapped around his right hand, causing white foam to form from the friction. Sulu held the old man's thin shoulder with one hand, while his right hand steadily and forcefully wiped the old man's back in front of him. The old man's wrinkled and lifeless skin had disappeared. Looking at the old man's thin body in front of him, he didn't know why, but he felt extremely sad. I am also a person from the Federation. After hearing the old man's question, Sulu lowered his head and thought for a moment. Then he put his right hand into the hot spring and continued to wipe the old man's back. He answered seriously, in that case, of course, you should choose to join the army to resist the invasion. Li Pifu, who was soaking naked in the hot spring, no longer had the heroic image of the military god in the Federation's propaganda film. He was just an ordinary dry old man. His silver hair was wet and tangled by the spring water, which made him look even more embarrassed. The old man coughed painfully for a few times and then said in a hoarse voice, I also thought so at that time. The story after that was actually a bit lackluster in the first few decades. Do you understand the meaning of the phrase lackluster? It's probably a shortened version of the Federation's proverb. I'm used to saying this because there are similar words in the Empire's language that my teacher taught me back then. Speaking of my teacher again, because in the next few decades my teacher, no Empire's master Fan Hua Jieyu, has been helping the 2 emperors of the Empire invade the Federation. There's not much I can do either. I joined the army and started as a normal soldier in the 17th Mechanic Division. Squad leader, platoon leader, company commander, battalion commander, regiment commander, and all the way to division commander. I've never been a deputy commander. This fact sometimes made me feel proud in the military camp, but sometimes when I thought about how this pride was only taught to me by someone from the Empire, my pride would often turn into mockery. So I worked even harder, or rather fought even harder. On the front lines, on the battlefield, in the rear, and in my interactions with those politicians, I hid all my shortcomings and hid all my loopholes, all for the sake of standing at a higher position and having more power to completely dispel that mockery. Back then, the Federation was in a very dangerous situation. Very dangerous. In the Westwoods, in the Empire's Star region, I also encountered many dangers. Then, I did the most dangerous thing, and that was, at the critical moment of a great defeat, I counterattacked like a madman and killed the Empire's emperor. Sulu, you've also been crazy before. You know that this kind of thing often relies on luck. My luck back then was pretty good. I fought many battles in the army, and many of my comrades and subordinates died. I thought that the Federation had also contributed a lot, but it couldn't compare to this at all. It seems that I, Li Pifu, have only done one thing in my life: killing the Empire's emperor. This is really boring. No one has ever dared to think that an M37 thousands of miles to assassinate the Empire's emperor is just boring. Sulu lowered his head and rubbed the old man's back. He muttered in a low voice with great disapproval, if this is considered boring, then can't you let me be bored a few more times? Little brat, killing is just a means. Li Pifu comforted him with a hoarse voice and said, what humans need is often the result. Of course, the result that time was pretty good. This has to do with luck. But from another perspective, my luck back then wasn't that good. Because when my eyes turned red, I forgot about life and death, forgot about the flying trajectories around my mecha, forgot about those screaming Empire's mechas, and even forgot that my name was Li Pifu. I only knew that when I was smashing the middle-aged man under the black hibiscus flag into minced meat, I didn't notice that Master Fan of the Empire was also beside him. His name was Hua Jieyu and he was my teacher. He taught me a strange ability that made my whole body tremble. Many years later, I used this ability to kill him. My teacher was a very beautiful black-haired man. He had a pair of eyes that spun faster than the stars. But at the last moment, the moment before he died, those eyes that were staring at me through the screen didn't even turn. In the hot pool, the god of war Li Pifu slowly told the story of killing his teacher. Although his voice was as calm as usual, his skinny body suddenly froze. The ripples on the surface of the hot spring instantly became calm. Su Li's right hand that was rubbing his back also froze. Chapter 674. If it had been someone else, they might have pretended not to hear and used their strong willpower to not investigate the truth of the story. Or they might have calmed down and moved their frozen right hand again, immediately forgetting the story as they kept wiping the old man's bony back. Because this story of killing his teacher, no matter how one looked at it, was definitely about Ge, the person Li Pifu wanted to forget the most in his glorious life. But Su Lu could not make such a reaction. His stiff right hand let go of the towel, and let the light green military towel scatter into a messy flower in the milky hot spring water. Then, he slowly moved his body to the side of the old man and stared at him with wide eyes. His thick, straight eyebrows were deeply furrowed until he had a headache thinking about the past he just learned. He directly opened his mouth and said, "Have you ever regretted it? I am a soldier." Of course, war god Li Pifu was a soldier. He was the most exemplary soldier in the Federation and even in the entire universe. So, although his answer was calm, it was full of weight. When it fell into the quiet hot spring water, it sank straight to the bottom without any ripples. He is my enemy. Killing the enemy on the battlefield is a soldier's natural responsibility. So, regarding this matter, I do not regret it, nor do I feel too much sadness or disappointment in a literary tone. It's just that sometimes when I think about it, I feel that life is indeed a little strange. If Hua Jiu teacher knew that he would die in my hands back then, would he have directly used that dusty travel bag to suffocate a little brat? A trace of a smile that had nothing to do with wisdom appeared on Li Pifu's wrinkled face. It was a sincere smile. Different from the noble and even sacred image in the hearts of the Federation citizens, the war god in real life often wanted to be an interesting person. But his status and responsibilities had long made him uninteresting for many years, so he could only be boring. Su Lu was a high-ranking officer of the new 17th Division, and from the sharp and even wretched fighting style of the army, he had long since caught a glimpse of the commanding style of the old man, as well as his personal temperament. Thus, when he heard these words, he did not find it strange. But just as he was about to ask more questions, the old man spoke again. Li Pifu slowly turned his head and calmly looked into Su Li's eyes. He said, "I do not regret loss, sadness, or anger, but that does not mean that person does not regret loss, sadness, or anger." Su Lu knew who the war god was talking about. That person had a mouthful of rotten teeth, that person liked to visit prostitutes, that person liked to wear blue denim overalls, tightly wrapped in blue cloth with a string of mechanical repair tools hanging behind his perky buttocks like wind chimes. That person liked to sit in a mine pit and stare blankly at the gray sky, or hold a glass of red wine and stare blankly at Jian Shuier on the screen. When the war god was mentioned, he liked to disdainfully call him old man. That person was the most famous person in the Federation because he was George Carlin, Professor Jean of Yue University, Feng Yu of a certain mechanics genius mechanic. But at the same time, he was also the most unknown person because almost no one in the Federation knew his real name. He was the war god Li Pifu's blood brother, he was the national idol Jian Shuier's father, and he was also the most beloved student of that imperial youngster called Hua Jiu. The cool breeze from the outdoor lake drifted in through the window lattice, blowing the hot steam above the hot spring into tangling strands. It was like a story from a long time ago. He narrowed his eyes as he watched the strands of steam intersecting, destroying and regenerating. He thought that he had a rough understanding of why this pair of most amazing brothers in the universe would be so tangled up in their love and hate. This is a very unoriginal story. Li Pifu's expression was calm in the hot spring. He said afterwards he came to ask me, tried to kill me and made a scene. So I gave him a slap, shattering many of his teeth. The two of us brothers never saw each other again after that. Never saw each other again. These were very simple words. and the tone of the old man Li Pifu was also extremely calm. But as the only listener, Sulu was still shocked to the point of being somewhat at a loss. This pair of brothers, whose blood was thicker than water, were undoubtedly the most talented and most amazing people. If they could walk side by side, they would definitely be able to write a more brilliant and indelible chapter in history. However, in the background of that magnificent era, they could only play out the most common melodramatic drama and soap operas. Thinking carefully, the sorrow of the big and the small could be interconnected. Turned out that they were still so sad. That battle that no one witnessed with their own eyes must have been a world-shaking battle. As for the final result of the uncle's crushing defeat, after seeing the uncle's magical ability, Sulu would not believe that there was anyone in the universe who could hurt or defeat him. But since it was Li Pifu who said this, he had to believe it. Especially when he recalled the ruthless way the uncle chewed the beef with his mouth full of rotten teeth, and the palm of Madman Li in the linuan that made his gums numb and bleed. Sulu held the warm water with both hands and splashed it on his face. After a while, he replied in a low voice, "I don't dare to comment on the fight between the elders. This is just a story, you don't need to comment on it." The old man closed his eyes tiredly and continued, "There is a lot more to the story. Now that I think about it, if I had killed him directly, maybe this story would have been much simpler and better." Suli's thick eyebrows were tightly knitted today. He came to Philadelphia to ask for the help of the army god and wanted to figure out the story. But the tone of the old man when he told the story, especially when it involved the uncle, always made him feel quite unhappy. "Don't blame me for saying this to my own brother." The old man's eyes were still closed. The wet hot spring water accumulated in his wrinkles, as if he had been accumulating words for many years. If you can clearly see what kind of person he is, perhaps you will come to the same conclusion. Until today, I still insist that the uncle is at least not a bad person. Sulu stared at the old man's face and insisted in a deep voice. "The two of us studied under the teacher at the same time. We learned the same skills, but we chose two different paths." The old man closed his eyes and slowly changed the topic. "When you were in Donglin, he must have been very young in your eyes, right?" "Yes." Sulu agreed after a moment of silence. This was what he was puzzled about. To be honest, he could make the benchmark chip that even the teacher couldn't make. He could hide from Zhang Yang's eyes. When it comes to learning, I can't compare to him. But I have always been stronger than him. Because I put all my time, energy, and even my entire life into learning or cultivation. I am focused, I am cautious, I am hardworking. The old man suddenly opened his eyes and looked at Sulu quietly. He said in a deep voice, "The Federation needs the protection of me and many other warriors. So I devoted all my life to making myself stronger. That is why, in this universe, there is no one who is stronger than me." Sulu was speechless. An indescribable feeling rose in his heart. These words sounded so narcissistic, so self-righteous, so arrogant, and so detestable. However, coming from the old man's mouth, they sounded so powerful. This was because he was not boasting. He was just stating a fact that the entire universe knew. But what did this have to do with the uncle? Emotions make one grow old easily. Worries make one grow old. Responsibility makes one grow old. Training makes one grow old. My life is one where I quickly burn my life in exchange for power. But he is not such a person. He doesn't seem to care about anything in this universe. He is not willing to make sacrifices for anything. Perhaps the word sacrifice doesn't even exist in his dictionary. His life is one of freedom and indifference. He has nothing to worry about. Naturally, he is able to see time more slowly. After a moment of silence, Sulu shook his head and said, "When we were in the Empire, Huai Chaosher, that lunatic great teacher, and you are also saying that the uncle is a cold and emotionless person. But I don't understand. What part of him is cold and emotionless? If he is cold and emotionless, why would he turn against his own brother for the sake of the Empire's teacher? If he is emotionless, why would he become George Carlin crying out for those oppressed people? Please don't say that the reason he could bear to ignore his own daughter for 16 years was because he was wanted by the Federation. Wanted? No, that's something that happened even later." Li Pifu slowly narrowed his eyes. His aged gaze was not turbid but calm, so calm that it made one's heart palpitate. He is a person who only does things according to his own likes and dislikes. His heart desires absolute freedom. He does everything on impulse. It was like this when he took revenge for his teacher. It is the same for George Carlin. Just like Muzi. Isn't it the result of his impulsiveness once again? His heart desires absolute freedom. What's wrong with that? Sulu retorted. Lipifu glanced at him indifferently and said, absolute freedom requires absolute power. It will never bring about true fairness and justice. As for George Carlin, a strong hint of mockery flashed in the old man's eyes. Sometimes the upper echelons of the Federation are like a pile of dog shit, but the freedom and fairness of the people have received the best guarantee in history. At times like this, those guys from Green Dragon Mountain only want to blow up this pile of dog shit, but they don't think about what will happen after the dog shit is blown up. It will be a pile of dog shit. The George Carlin that he is playing is the role of a shit stirrer. You don't have to rush to refute me. Since he is still alive, you can ask him personally when you have the chance in the future. Why did he come up with the George Carlin doctrine? Actually, this is just the continuation of hatred. I respect and try to protect the foundation of the Federation, so he tries to destroy this foundation. The order of society is part of it. The glory of the charter is the more important part. Chapter 675. Absolute freedom definitely did not mean absolute fairness and justice. This was a simple and correct statement because freedom had no logical relationship with the latter two nouns. However, Lipifu had pointed out that the uncle's resistance against the glory of the charter had nothing to do with freedom, which still made Sulu feel very unhappy. The camouflage chip behind his neck that allowed him to freely travel around the Federation had been with him for a very long time. For him, the chip and the method the uncle taught him were the same as freedom. Even though he had a weird friendship with the Federal Central Computer later, it was still the same. I don't want to discuss the relationship between the chip and the dog leash, the 700,000-word restriction clause of the first charter, and the practical significance of the Federation surveillance network for a galactic regime. This can be mentioned. Sulu frowned and said, I once thought about this question when I was young, but I didn't have an answer. You've been to the Imperium. Li Bofu looked into his eyes and said, if you want to maintain a space regime that is so vast, and the speed of information exchange and the transmission of force has different levels, if you don't have a comprehensive electronic monitoring network, then there is only massacre. Sulu was silent. Don't continue with this question. The old man coughed twice, his thin chest rising and falling violently, making the milky hot spring water ripple. What I want to say is the man's attitude. A person who has the ability to surpass the control of the state apparatus is trying to break through the security system at the bottom of society. What he pursues is freedom without control. The scary thing is that he has this ability, so who knows what he will do. This is still based on the assumption that the uncle is a bad person. Sulu shook his head. When human beings were born, there was no good, evil, good or bad. Therefore, human beings can become good or bad at any time. Lipifu said indifferently. And for him, George Carlin, breaking through the glory of the charter. These enormous revenge plans that even made me feel uneasy. He was not in the mood to carry them out. Instead, he played with them irresponsibly for a few years and then threw them away. He played countless roles in the Federation and made countless friends, but did he care about any of them? Have you contacted anyone else? When that gentle and loyal man from the previous generation of the Tai family died of depression because of him, did he return to S1 to take a look at him? If such a person isn't heartless and cold, who else is worthy of these 4 words? It is also because of this that I feel cold and even fear. So the Federation wants to arrest him and you want to kill him? No, he's my blood brother, and he got to know that good friend of mine at UA University. Before he really did something unforgivable, no one in the Federation government would think of dealing with him, even if they found out later that he was George Carlin. As for whether the Bureau of Proclamation investigated him, I didn't know the details back then. I'll say the same thing again. If I had known that things would develop like this, I would have killed him myself. What happened after that? How did the uncle become the most wanted criminal? And with the identity of the mechanic Feng Yu? The old man waved his hand and signaled for him to continue scrubbing his back. He said in a low voice, What happened after that is still a very cliché story. This story is very cliché, and it's related to a woman. Sulu twisted the wet towel in his hand into a flower, and his eyebrows furrowed into a flower. He asked uncertainly, Shui-er's mother? I don't know the details in the beginning because it happened in the Empire. I also don't know when he, who was playing the role of the mechanic Fengyu, got together with her. She was teacher's youngest daughter, much younger than all of us. When I went to the Empire as a child, she hadn't given birth yet. I didn't even see her. I only knew that she became the Empire's empress later on. That year, the Federation prepared for a very long time and started to attack the Empire's territory. I also prepared for a very long time, and so did Madame. All the war preparations were very rich, enough to support a war that spanned the entire region. Mr. President, and we all believe that even if we couldn't take down Tianjing planet in this war, we would definitely be able to drag down the Empire's Baiyan dynasty. However, the intelligence system didn't discover one thing. The Empire's empress had secretly escaped from the palace with a maid and a baby. She lived in seclusion on a planet at the border of the Empire. And that planet was an important strategic base target in the Federation's military plan. Sulu, you fought in wars before, so you should know the ironclad rule of the battlefield. People will always die in wars. Teacher's youngest daughter, the Empire's empress, was also an ordinary person, so she also died. Mu Zi, who was still a baby at that time, was also in a dangerous situation in the flames of war. The Federation's frontline troops thought that they had already controlled the situation and transported the most important batch of strategic resources to the border planet. At this time, perhaps it was to take revenge for the Empire's empress, or perhaps it was to take advantage of the chaos to rescue Mu Zi. In any case, he wanted to do something. The Federal Central Computer was secretly investigating him at that time, and the glory of the Charter had already extended a few tentacles. Although he was indeed a crazy genius, it was very difficult for him to do anything under those circumstances. So he really went crazy. Li Pifu's tone became colder and colder. Hearing these words, Su Li's straight eyebrows raised more and more. He said, "The woman is dead, and the daughter is about to die. Anyone would go crazy." Li Pifu looked at him coldly and said, "That was a huge explosion at the reserve base. The Federation's most elite mechanized troops sacrificed 76,311 people in this explosion. The final official report only admitted that slightly more than 10,000 people sacrificed, but in reality, 76,311 people died. As for the soldiers who lost their ability to fight, there were even more of them. The 74 tons of crystal mines that Lady Tai ordered the Crystal Mining Consortium to prepare with all its might were all destroyed in this explosion. The federal forces were forced to withdraw. The war that had been prepared for 8 years ended just like that. The official report said that countless soldiers of the Imperium received the military deployment provided by the traitor and turned out in full force, so the federal forces were forced to withdraw. In fact, this was not the case. All of this was just the result of the madness of that cold and heartless man. The distant foreign planet, the princess of the Imperium who was running away with her illegitimate daughter in her arms, the ambitious iron stream of the Federation on the planet filled with smoke, the mechanic who was wearing an old military uniform and staring indifferently at the distance, the terrifying explosion, and thousands of frustrated soldiers who were about to die. Countless bloody pictures flashed in front of Su Li's eyes quickly. He jumped into the slightly hot spring pool, but his body was still cold and he began to shiver. Chapter 676. I don't care how many identities he has, but at that time, he was an officer of the Federation, and the more than 70,000 soldiers who died at his hands were all his comrades. Li Pifu narrowed his old eyes and added coldly, "I don't believe it." Sulu stared at the pool water in front of his chest that was getting murkier and murkier. In the warm mist, his voice cracked. It was unknown whether it was because of the cold or because he was grinding his teeth. "I don't believe this. Although Uncle isn't a good person, how could he do such a thing?" The old man simply closed his eyes and ignored his sour and gloomy self-encouragement. With the sound of splashing water, Sulu looked up at his old and calm face and said excitedly, "Although that was a battlefield with Uncle's ability, There was no need to make such a big commotion to save Shui. The old man closed his eyes and rested silently. Sulu waved his arms and said loudly, "According to what you said, he caused that explosion, so the Federation started to put him on the wanted list. You also wanted to kill him at all times, so why did he give Shui to you? You brothers turned against each other, so why did he trust you so much?" Because Mu Zi was born in the Empire. She didn't have a birth certificate. She was still a baby and didn't have a chip implanted behind her neck. Li Pifu slowly opened his eyes, and a trace of fatigue flashed through his eyes. He said slowly, "Because of the war, the Federation started to strictly control the flow of people in Bermuda a year ago, especially the management of returnees and adopted children. At that time, the entire Federation, including the Bureau of Proclamation and myself, didn't know that my teacher had made such a far-sighted, sinister, and vicious seed plan. We only strengthened the management for safety reasons. After you killed Macklin, the Bureau of Proclamation's purge has been confirmed. Since that war, no one with the blood of the Empire has snuck into the Federation. Mu Zi cannot stay in the Empire because she is the illegitimate daughter of the Empress and an outsider. As the Emperor, Huai Fuchai will not allow such a disgrace to exist, so the Empire is too dangerous for Mu Zi. He can only bring Mu Zi back to the Federation, but there's no better way to let Mu Zi grow up safely and healthily in the Federation than to hand her over to me." Sulu frowned and listened carefully. He asked why. Li Pifu understood what he meant. He glanced at him and said, "Constantly changing chips and surviving in the cracks of the glory of the Charter is not a pleasant thing." He liked absolute freedom, but he was very clear about the price of this absolute freedom. How could he let his own daughter repeat such a dangerous life? "As for why you gave Mu Zi to me," the old man coughed twice and continued, "because I can very easily let Mu Zi into the Federation. As for the so-called trust, that is not the key. In the end, Mu Zi is of the blood of my old Li family, and I, Li Pifu, have always been a traditional and conservative person." From that day onwards, the Lees of Philadelphia gained a baby girl of unknown origins. Madam may have guessed a little, but since she has never asked me, I naturally won't explain anything. I named that baby girl Jian Mu Zi because in my opinion she has no father or mother. She is a spirit randomly picked up from the stars by the heavens. She is called Mu Zi, but I still hope that she can brand the surname of the Li family on her. At the mention of the beautiful girl who is currently fighting on the front lines of the Empire, a gentle and calm smile appeared on the old man's wrinkled face. It was as if he was thinking of that cute little fairy-like existence many years ago. He was no longer that calm and dignified war god, but just an extremely ordinary old man. Looking at the smile on the old man's face, it would seem disrespectful to ask more questions about this matter, so Sulu pursed his lips. After a moment of silence, he changed the topic. "Why, during the military exercise, did the Emperor of the Empire go crazy and order the Westwoods Expeditionary Force to attack? I know that this is definitely because he knows Jian Shuer's identity, but the problem is that no one in the Federation knows this secret. The Emperor of the Empire is far away in the left Skystar region, so how did he know? The reason is very simple. There is a truth and there is a secret." Li Pifu slowly withdrew his smile and looked at Sulu. His eyes that had seen who knows how much smoke and blood were so calm, but also seemed to contain countless deep meanings. "You should know by now that the surname of Master Fan of the Empire is Hua. No one knows why, but in my opinion it is probably because they are too beautiful, like the flowers that bloom in the forest. The so-called truth is their faces. Mu Zi having such a beautiful face is the best evidence. I am one of the engineers of MXT. Although I don't study much philosophy and aesthetics, please don't use such words to humiliate my logical ability." Sulu tiredly picked up the warm water and washed his face. "The most important reason, of course, is that secret." Li Pifu looked at him quietly. "How can I let you know the secret?" After a long silence, Sulu suddenly said with his head lowered, "Is it because of that bracelet? Is that bracelet the star map that the former Master Fan gave to Uncle?" Li Pifu's white eyebrows gradually furrowed, but strangely, this didn't mean that he was angry. Instead, one could see traces of a smile between his wrinkled eyebrows. As expected of the Federation's most talented engineer after him, the old man didn't look at him anymore. With a trace of peace, He leaned against the bluestone pool and closed his eyes. He slowly said, "In the entire universe, only an extremely small number of people know of the existence of the star map. To them, that star map might be able to change everything. I used to think so too. For the Federation, I was willing to do anything to obtain that star map. But when I finally found out what was hidden in that bracelet, I realized that all of us were wrong. Many people think that the star map is another space passage between the Empire and the Federation. Actually, it is just a gift. It is just that people don't seem to need that gift anymore, so it is just a birthday gift from a father to a daughter." "I don't understand," Sulu replied very honestly, "but I understand what you mean. Since it is of no practical significance to the Federation, then no one will know what the bracelet on Shui Er's wrist is. If someone knows and tries to take it, I will protect it for her." This was a promise from a young man to an old man. That old-fashioned old man didn't care about the price, and he didn't care about the price. He silently watched the little girl grow into a national idol of the Federation, and an adult with her own independent life. Now, it was only natural that the protector would change to the next generation. Li Pifu opened his eyes and looked at Sulu quietly. There was a hint of mockery in his calm eyes. "The problem is that you have too many people to protect." At this point in the conversation, Sulu felt the most difficult embarrassment to resist hit him. During the spaceflight from the desolate mineral planet back to the Huangyi base, although his dream lover didn't say it out loud, her behavior and affectionate eyes had shown her feelings for him. Therefore, he was at a loss and ecstatic, but in addition to his joy, he was also filled with infinite fear. Years ago, under the night sky of Donglin, he cried and shouted that he would marry Jian Shuier as his wife. When had he ever dared to hope that it would come true? When his dream really shone into reality, who would care about the damn idol phobia? Who would care about the unreal sense of alienation? The problem was that all the military leaders thought that he was Minister Zhou's prospective son-in-law. The problem was that it was said that the plump but intelligent forever female engineer in the underground warehouse of the industrial park in Harbor City had called off the marriage. The problem was that it was said that the beautiful, quiet, and pitiful young lady of the Southern Prime Minister's family had already arrived in the capital. Facing the pressure of being imprisoned for life, and the threat of White Sausher's death in the mansion of Master Fan of the Empire, he once poured out his heart. Even the little cute classmate under the black spectacles who had hurt him in the Parliament Mountain spontaneously felt a strong sense of attachment and strong unwillingness. These were all very good, and they were all what he wanted very much. He looked ordinary, and after he became a teenager, he rarely spoke with words. Under his gentle and plain appearance, there was a flaw of stubbornness and indifference. No matter how one looked at him, he was not a character that could easily attract the attention of women, especially outstanding women. There were so many bright stars in the universe. Being able to get Jian Shuier was definitely beyond Su Li's wildest fantasy in his youth. Now, in the blink of an eye, there were still so many stars, which was very annoying. This was really the most shameless annoyance of a man. Countless emotions constantly changed on Su Li's face. Joy, shame, self-mockery, self-blame, self-abasement, and many other expressions were mixed together. It was difficult to describe the bitterness, sweetness, and bitterness, just like the white mist above the hot spring pool. He completely did not notice when the old man had left the pool and was putting on his clothes and shoes with the help of the orderlies. Li Pifu slowly turned around and looked at the young man with the most disgusting expression at the moment by the bluestone pool. Suppressing the urge to slap this person to death, he frowned and said in a deep voice, "If you want to be with Mu Zi, you have to deal with these problems within this year and go to Feiqing to propose marriage." Sulu was stunned. He stood up from the water with a splash and looked in shock at the old man who had turned around and left. He quickly wiped his wet body. From the old man's words there were at least two meanings. First, the Federal Army's military operation in the Empire's X3 star system would definitely end within this month. Otherwise, Shuier would not be able to make it back in time. Second, as the Federation's military god, the old man did not consider Minister Zhou, the Nan family, or the Nutshell Company at all. "Don't forget, Mu Zi was raised by me." Li Pifu suddenly turned around at the door and looked at Su Lu. He slowly said, "She is my daughter." The military god's old body trembled when the matter concerned Jian Shui'er's lifelong happiness. The Federation would definitely back off. But why was he in such a hurry? Chapter 677. Sulu got out of the hot spring pool as fast as he could, dried his body, and put on the brand new military uniform and boots that had been prepared for him at the door. He carefully checked his appearance. He missed the casual clothes that he wore when he came to Philadelphia, and he didn't understand why the army god would prepare clothes for him. Li Pifu was walking out of the courtyard with his body half bent. His shoulders were as flat as a mountain rock that was about to collapse. Sulu chased after the figure. His hard military boots stepped on the wooden floor and made a clear sound. "I don't want to be a general." He glanced at the Major General epaulet on his shoulder and said loudly to the old man, "I came to Philadelphia to say this, not to say this. With your contributions to the Federation, you are definitely qualified to be a Major General. But when the Department of Defense asked for my opinion, I didn't want to." The old man slowly walked in the quiet wooden corridor with his hands behind his back. He didn't look up and said in a low voice, "After all, you are too young. As a compensation, I will give you a set of clothes to satisfy your cravings." Hearing this, Sulu almost tripped and fell to the ground. He once again had a clearer understanding of the army god's temperament. At the end of the corridor, Li Pifu slowly stopped and straightened his body. Although his movement was slow, it contained some kind of unquestionable power. It was like a mountain that was about to collapse due to the erosion of wind and rain. He once again stood up and stared at the ruthless sky indifferently. "I have already called Chief Judge He-ing." Sulu stopped and stared blankly at the old man's back. Only then did he realize that the old man had not said a single word from the beginning to the end, but he knew the purpose of his visit and had already made arrangements in advance. The old man didn't look back. His hands were still behind his back. His hands were old and full of veins, but he gave people a feeling that as long as he wanted to, he could crush any star in the universe. The outcome of the Westwoods lawsuit must be based on the laws of the Federation. No matter who it is, they must respect this. That includes you and me. Of course, I have to admit that sometimes, people like you and me who have some kind of power can't help but break the boundaries of the law and do things that are pleasurable. But that's not right. You insisted on asking that old judge to step in, and I commend your efforts. As for the things you haven't had the time to say, the old man turned his head and looked at him quietly. Soldiers are not allowed to interfere in politics. This is an iron law. Anyone who tries to break this iron law will be swept into the garbage heap of history. Sulu was moved or shocked. He remembered what Minister Zhou had said in the hotel office many years ago. The army is not allowed to have their own thoughts because it is too dangerous. As a person who possessed a terrifying military force, he was wary of this terrifying force, and he was so determined to find a way to control this force. This kind of soldier was a true soldier, a cornerstone of the Federation. "Thank you very much for your support." Sulu saluted and then said with a trace of shame, "But I am not qualified to be mentioned in the same breath as you. Don't be superstitious about old people." A smile appeared on the wrinkles on Li Bofu's face, diluting the uncomfortable feeling of age a little. "I have never met anyone stronger than me in my life, but I am old after all, and everyone will grow old just like every young person will grow up. Hui Chaosher, little Feng, and you, no matter how you look at it, you are qualified to be mentioned in the same breath as us in the past." The old man raised his arm and gently patted him on the shoulder. Young people should have the strength to do what they think is right. Fei Chang told a story from a long time ago in the hot spring pool. Sulu rubbed the old man's back for a long time. But this action of patting the old man's shoulder was the first time that the old man showed some kind of intimacy. The two were half a meter apart, but Sulu didn't notice that the old man raised his arm and stretched his elbow. He didn't have time to dodge or do anything else. He found that the old man's hand fell on his shoulder and then gently patted twice. Thinking of the cup of yellow tea in the tea room, although he didn't know that the tea had turned into water vapor, Sulu couldn't help but be in awe of the old man's terrifying strength. He couldn't help but think in his heart, in front of an old man like you, which young man dares to think that he is more powerful? Can Hui Chaosher? A group of orderlies who had been waiting outside the corridor for a long time rushed over. They carefully tidied up Li Pifu and Su Li's appearance and combed their hair. 2 orderlies even squatted down and wiped their military boots until they were shiny. Su Lu was not used to the feeling of being served by so many people. He did not understand why these orderlies who came out of nowhere had to take care of him. He looked at the war god not far in front of him, whose white hair fluttered in the wind under the hair dryer. He felt that this scene was a little ridiculous and funny. As for other things, you don't need to worry about them. The old man's words were a bit erratic in the strong wind. Although my son doesn't know how to fight, he is much stronger than everyone in the Federation thinks. Hearing this, Su Lu was finally relieved. As long as the old man agreed to let General Li Jiedu become the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, those hardline hawks in the military wouldn't be able to cause too much trouble. Moreover, the old man's calm comment at the end showed that he had strong confidence in his own son. After the orderlies finished tidying up the 2's hair and clothes, they held up a mirror and asked the 2 to look at themselves. The old man and the young man probably hadn't taken care of their appearance so seriously in their lives. Naturally, they wouldn't complain about the smoothness of their sideburns and boots. The orderlies saluted collectively and then quickly left. A moment later, Su Lu understood why the orderlies were taking care of his appearance. A gust of wind blew. More than a dozen news reporters carrying all kinds of camera equipment walked in from the back of the courtyard. They began to take photos of Li Pifu and Su Lu on the stage. The flashes lit up from time to time, which made Su Li's eyes narrow even more. He almost couldn't hold the hand that the old man personally extended to him. Holding the old man's cold and incomparably thick hand, Su Lu turned around and looked at the camera lens like a puppet. From the logos on the camera lens, he found that the ones who were qualified to enter the Philadelphia courtyard were the largest news media, including the Capital Special District Daily News and the News Channel. He recognized the famous on-camera reporter from the News Channel, the reporter Wood from the Capital Special District Daily News, and even saw Bai Ziming among the reporters. This guy, who became one of the top directors in the Federation because of the documentary Team 7, actually came in person today. The expressions on the faces of the reporters were very strange. No one greeted Su Lu, including Bai Ziming. He didn't even blink. There were no interviews, no questions. The reporters just silently took photos and chose the best angle to get the best picture. This kind of collective silence actually caused the originally chaotic scene to gradually give birth to a solemn, dignified atmosphere that contained a little fanaticism. Probably because these reporters were very clear about the significance of today's shooting to the entire Federation, and even to history. In the Philadelphia courtyard on the stone steps there was the god of war Li Pifu and Colonel Su Lu. They were shaking hands. This was the inheritance. I have one more question. Why are you willing to tell me the story of that year in such detail? Because perhaps in the near future, there will be many similar cliché stories that will happen, so I hope you can learn something from this story. This was the last conversation between Su Lu and the old man before he said goodbye. He didn't know what kind of stories might happen in the future. He was shocked and confused. He walked out of the manor along the bluestone path between the rice field and the fish pond. Then he was shocked to find that the person who sent him out of the hospital was actually General Li Jiedu. I'm really flattered today. Su Lu looked at General Li Jiedu next to him and explained nervously. At the moment when the chairman of the Joint Staff of the Federation was about to be replaced, he thought that General Li Jiedu would definitely stay in the Capital Special District. He didn't expect General Li Jiedu to come back to Philadelphia. After a little deduction, he knew who General Li Jiedu came for. Su Lu said that he was flattered because of the fact that General Li Jiedu, who was sandwiched between God of War Li Pifu and Li Feng, was full of scholarly demeanor. He was so low-key that no one would have a bad impression of him. He was flattered not only because General Li Jiedu specially came to accompany him, but also because of the pictures taken by the reporters. The glory of the Lis of Philadelphia was the medal that God of War Li Pifu and his 3 generations fought for the Federation at all costs. How could he take away the inheritance and pride that should have belonged to Li Jiedu and Li Feng? I don't know what kind of person Uncle is, but I think some of his ideas are very interesting. Glory is sometimes a kind of pressure that we have no choice but to accept. General Li Jiedu smiled gently and said, I was in poor health when I was young. I couldn't bear this kind of pressure, so I had to pass the pressure to Li Feng. Li Feng left home to join the army when he was 12 years old. He fought and killed, seizing every second to train as if his life depended on it. Why? It was to protect the glory of the Li family, but this is actually a kind of harm to his life. Facing the sunset slowly descending from the west, General Li Jiedu gazed at him and said gently, "So I have always felt a deep sense of guilt toward him. If you can take away this kind of pressure from the family, I will thank you from the bottom of my heart." Su Li's lips and tongue were somewhat dry. He understood that General Li Jiedu was not being pretentious. Thinking of the matter Zhou mentioned, he said heavily, "I am very sorry." General Li Jiedu gazed at him calmly and said, "I admire everything you have done in the past, so I don't think you have anything to be sorry about, at least until now." Chapter 678. Li Feng thought I was dead, so he... Su Lu said in a low voice, thinking of the violent young man who called him little uncle, who was worried that no one would be able to resist Huai Chaoshi after his death. He didn't hesitate to damage his body to improve his strength. He felt a little depressed. This is his own choice, and everyone can only be responsible for their own choices. Li Jiedu looked at him with a smile. There's not much difference between living for 100 years and living for 70 years. As long as you live a wonderful life, I know my son. He won't regret it. Su Lu nodded after a moment of silence. When Muzi comes back from the front line, come to Philadelphia for dinner. Let's get together as a family, Li Jiedu said in an indisputable tone. At this moment, this gentle general was playing the role of Muzi's father, so what he said was natural. Su Li's face turned slightly red. He saluted and said, "Yes, General. Feng Yu had once said that the only obligation he had the right to undertake was to do what he thought was right at any time." Su Lu always felt that he had heard this sentence from someone before. Every time this sentence came out from his uncle's mouth full of rotten teeth, mixed with the smell of red wine and beef, he would habitually have a lot of questions. Was what he thought was right really right? Many years later, in the manor of the Lis of Philadelphia, Su Lu heard the old story told by the god of war Li Pifu and knew the truth of the big explosion. Although he knew that the story was often very different from the person who told it, he subconsciously felt that what the old man said was true. That year, when he broke into the foundation building with a gun to kill Macklin, it seemed to be very violent. In fact, Su Lu still needed evidence to support his actions, and he and Shi Qinghai had found enough evidence. Feng Yu didn't need evidence. He only acted on impulse based on his likes and dislikes. Su Lu knew that he couldn't act as freely as his uncle. When he was in Master Fan's mansion, he said to Huai Chaoshi that he was very selfish. That uncle was probably the real selfish person. Thinking of this, Su Lu felt frustrated, lost, and all kinds of complicated emotions. If the uncle who raised her, taught her many skills, and was regarded as the closest to her, was really a heartless and cold guy like what Mr. Li and many others said, how could she face him? It was precisely because of these emotions that the expensive orange wine in the cup suddenly became sour and unpalatable, causing his thick ink-like eyebrows to furrow deeply. "Mr. Su, is there a problem with this wine?" A flight attendant with picturesque eyebrows opened her big and innocent eyes, half squatted beside the first-class seat, nervously looked at his face, and gently and nervously asked, "No, it tastes good." Su Lu raised the cup with 3 fingers and said gently, "By the way, thank you for just now." After boarding the plane in Philadelphia, the beautiful flight attendant in the first-class cabin recognized Su Lu immediately, the hero of the Federation who had just returned from the Empire. Even if he wore big sunglasses and had an ordinary face, after experiencing the sensation of the documentary, the attention of the whole nation during the live broadcast, and several press conferences, it was impossible for him to hide among the ordinary people. Fortunately, Su Lu reacted very quickly and put a finger in front of his lips. The beautiful flight attendant covered her mouth in surprise and suppressed the exclamation. Otherwise, this night flight would be very lively. The flight attendant winked and smiled gently and returned to the operating cabin with the tray. A few suppressed exclamations and a series of cute laughter faintly sounded. Su Lu knew that those young and energetic girls were probably talking about him. He couldn't help but smile. After a while, He suddenly found that the passengers in the cabin outside the curtain were exclaiming one after another. He was a bit puzzled and subconsciously looked up. He saw that on the TV screen, the news channel of the Federation was temporarily broadcasting an important news. It was still the same female anchor, who announced that Senator Pabre would visit Green Dragon Mountain a few years ago. It was still the same calm mixed with excitement. The dignified and beautiful female anchor smiled at the camera and said, "The winner of the Purple Merit Medal of the Federation, the famous war hero Sulu, welcomed the third day of his return to the Federation. To everyone's surprise, he didn't attend the grand banquet organized by the Nutshell Company. Instead, he went to Philadelphia." Speaking of this, the female anchor paused and then said with a smile, "The Eternal Army God of the Federation, Marshal Lipifu cordially received Colonel Sulu, who had just returned in his mansion." The two sides had a long conversation. This is the first time that Marshal Lipifu has received an active military officer of the Federation in his home in Philadelphia in the past 10 years. He also allowed the news media to record it. The following is the live footage that has just been sent back by our reporter. On the night flight from Philadelphia to the Capital Special District, there was a temporary silence because of this news. Then there was a burst of spontaneous applause. This was the most luxurious apartment building in the Capital Special District. The top 3 floors were all connected, and the dome was luxuriously covered with super strong synthetic transparent glass. At the end of the corridor on the right, there was a small room full of real or fake flowers. The most eye-catching one was still the oil painting of sunflowers. If this oil painting was real, then this oil painting alone could buy this entire apartment building. In fact, with the identity of the owner of this apartment, of course, it was impossible to buy a fake one and put it in his own room. According to the rules of the Lees of Philadelphia, boys before the age of 12 must study in the Body Cultivation Hall. I don't know if you have been to those places. After not seeing each other for a long time, Li Xiaotong, the 7th young master who seemed to be the most qualified to compete with Li Xiuzhu for the position of the heir of the Li family, was still gloomy like a plum blossom in the snow. He lowered his head and cut the bloody dongleng steak, which actually made him look like a cold butcher. However, at this time, Li Xiaotong's expression was very peaceful, even a little deliberately intimate. From a long time ago, he was used to facing the guy across the long table with this kind of expression. The rules of our family are different. On the 12th birthday, all the boys who are close to the family are allowed to choose a gift from the family. This gift may be a spaceship, a small manor, or a few beautiful and gentle maids. But these gifts can't be resold or given away. The elders in the family mainly want to see how the gifts will appreciate after many years. The gift that Li Xiuzhu chose back then appreciated a lot and was very well received by the elders. When I was 12, I chose this painting that you are looking at now. At the time, many people thought that I had made a mistake, but reality proved that I was right. The value of this sunflower painting by Gao Fan has increased by 34 times over the past 10 years. Li Xiaotong looked at Su Lu on the other side of the long table with a smile. He raised his glass and said, "But that's nothing. The wisest decision I've made in my life was the investment I made in you years ago. Now, it seems to be a rather insignificant investment. Now, who in the family dares to doubt my judgment?" Sulu shook his head and didn't want to pay attention to this guy who was obviously too excited. He held the wine and stared at the oil painting of sunflowers on the wall and said, "I don't like this painting." In the Imperial Palace of Tianjing, the big screen in front of Her Majesty was full of golden sunflowers. This easily makes me think of that very shitty life of escape. "Then I will change it tomorrow," Li Xiaotong said very seriously. "Why don't you burn it?" Sulu shrugged and said mockingly, "Well, then I will burn it." Li Xiaotong's answer was still very serious. For him, a priceless oil painting was far less important than Su Li's feelings, because priceless things always had a price. Things with a price were not things for a person with a strong sense of foresight, but for a priceless investment target like Su Lu, or in other words, a friend he really valued. Su Lu was startled and said helplessly, "I shouldn't have thought that you young masters from the 7 great families are normal people." Speaking of returning to Feicheng, I did visit the Body Cultivation Center and had a lot of feelings. But you don't understand these things. I wanted to ask Brother Zeng, but he was not here. He looked at the empty wall behind Li Xiaotong and narrowed his eyes. He thought of the middle-aged man who was as cold and dangerous as an iron spear and felt a little regretful. Brother Zeng said that since you are here I am safe. It is rare for him to have a holiday. Li Xiaotong smiled and said, by the way, I have seen the news of you going to Feiqing. I am deeply shocked. Why are you shocked? The battle for the successor of the army god has finally come to an end. Aren't you shocked? Li Xiaotong said with a serious and happy expression. In the past few years, the Federation has been deliberately promoting Du Shaoqing and his Iron 7th Division. But as soon as you came back, Feiqing directly expressed their attitude. How interesting is it to wear such a big hat? Su Lu shook his head. That's true. Li Xiaotong said with a serious expression. According to the latest news, Commander Shaoqing did not show any emotion after seeing the news at the front line. But I am afraid that the Imperial troops in the X3 system will have to bear the endless anger of the Iron 7th Division. Commander Shaoqing is not such a person. Let's talk about the old man. I saw him up close once when I was young. Li Xiaotong asked curiously, how is the old man now? The old man's body is very good. Su Lu thought of the thin old man in the hot spring pool, and the hidden worries that Zhou Yu once mentioned. He said confusedly, in my opinion, he can at least live for another 5 or 6 years. Li Xiaotong knew that Su Lu would never talk nonsense on such an important matter. Knowing that the army god was in good condition, he subconsciously leaned back and appeared to be very relaxed. Seeing his movement, Su Lu felt something in his heart. For most people in the Federation, the thin old man by Lake Feiqing was the biggest guarantee and the most powerful source of confidence for them to live a peaceful life. As long as the old man was alive, the world would be as beautiful as ever. Suppressing the complicated emotions in his heart, he looked at Li Xiaotong across the table and asked seriously, about the case of the Zhong family, I asked you to help me. How's the preparation? I am sorry. Li Xiaotong gently wiped the corners of his mouth and said worriedly, the government and these big families are secretly exerting pressure. No lawyer dares to accept this case. Su Lu frowned very hard. The Supreme Court was about to open, but no one expected that at this time, there would suddenly be a very serious problem in the old house of the Zhong family. The famous lawyer who handled legal affairs for the Shizhou law firm as a guest had to withdraw from the case in advance for some depressing reason. Lawyer, he is the best lawyer in the Federation. Li Xiaotong sighed and said, but he is the son of the Chief Justice. If he doesn't withdraw, Chief Justice He Ying will definitely not preside over the case. At this time the door of the apartment was pushed open. A man with neatly combed hair and wearing a dark suit came in with an umbrella under his arm. He looked a little funny. He said with a gloomy face, thank you for your compliment, but the biggest problem we are facing now is not the lack of a leading lawyer, but the other side suddenly changed their strategy. The man stared into Su Li's eyes and said, they want to fight the custody case first. Don't forget that although the relatives over there are disgusting and shameless, they are Miss Zhong's relatives after all. But none of you have the surname Zhong, so this custody case will be very difficult to fight. If they get the custody of Miss Zhong Huayan, then there is no need to fight the ownership case of Guzhong Company. This is a vicious move. Chapter 679. The middle-aged man who walked in with an umbrella under his arm didn't need to introduce himself. Su Lu already knew who he was. This was the son of the Chief Justice of the Federation, the most famous lawyer in the capital ring, Lawyer He. The worry in his words made the atmosphere in the room tense and silent. Water dripped from the umbrella and dyed the precious carpet on the ground a dark color. Su Lu put down the chopsticks in his hand and stared blankly at the gradually wetting carpet on the ground. He wasn't good at legal matters, but he knew very well that if those old fogies of the Silin Zhong family really resorted to underhanded means like a custody fight, then little Watermelon would be in great trouble. At this time, the last participant of tonight's gathering finally pushed open the door and walked in. The young man's body was still slightly thin, and his face was still that unhealthy pale. Braving the rain, his hair was wet, tangled into a few strands of somewhat embarrassing black hair. The water droplets on the thin green camel hair windbreaker were rolling down, hitting the blanket softly and silently. Li Xiaotong reacted immediately. He bowed seriously with a rare trace of cautiousness and put his hands on his abdomen. He said respectfully according to some old etiquette, "I'm Li Xiaotong. Thank you very much for coming to my house." Lawyer He reacted very quickly. He immediately stepped aside and pulled out the golden silk chair that was said to be big enough to replace 3 of the latest cars. He said submissively, "Prince, this way please." Su Lu was still frowning and worrying about his own troubles. For him, Taiziong was a very good friend, that was all. However, the cold and arrogant Li Xiaotong and Lawyer He, who he had just met but was free and straightforward, showed such serious reactions to Taiyuan's arrival. It suddenly made him think of Taiyuan's true identity. He looked up curiously at Taiyuan, who was taking off his windbreaker. He silently thought that even if the Tai family was the descendant of the former royal family, many years had passed. In the current situation where crystal mines were scarce, the Tai family's influence on the Federation should be far less than it used to be. Why did the other families of the 7 major families still show so much respect to the lady in the back mountain and his thin and weak prince friend? This kind of respect with a strong sense of inequality, or even some kind of fear. They had known each other for many years. Probably only people like himself and Mr. Sure dared to not take Taizuan seriously. The night was dark. After dinner, Su Lu and Taizuan held their glasses of red wine and leaned against the transparent railing of the top floor of the apartment. They looked down at the crowd of people walking around in a hurry and were silent for a long time. "You looked like a mess when you walked in just now," Su Lu said. "In my memory, other than when you were in a coma, your appearance was always impeccable. From the villa to the gold pin on your collar, everything was clean and tidy. How could you be so wet?" "Yuzi should have told you that I had a falling out with my family." Taizuan smiled and said, "It happened recently. During this time I learned a lot of things, such as how to open a personal account in the bank, how to squeeze into the subway with other people, and how to use an umbrella to cover my face when the rain is too heavy without caring about my clothes. How do you feel?" Su Lu turned his head and looked at him curiously. "I remember you said before that you can experience the life of the common people, but you don't have the extra time to learn or feel." "I don't feel good." Taizion looked at the rippling red wine in his glass and said with a smile, "Fortunately, you're back. Naturally, I'll leave the matter of the West Woods to you. Tomorrow, I'll go back to the back of Macho Mountain to cry and be a filial son again. Oh right, I'll get married next autumn. Thank you first. I'm referring to the matter of the West Woods." Sulu looked at him and said seriously, "If it weren't for you, the Zhong family's old mansion would have had a harder time this year. To be honest, I really didn't expect that a confident and arrogant guy like you would have this so-called cheap sympathy. At that time everyone thought you were dead. They were a little shocked, so they occasionally went crazy," Taizion replied indifferently. "Then congratulations." Sulu raised his wine glass and teased, "I only hope that after you get married, you won't hand over the responsibility of taking care of Miss Bai Chi to me. You seem to have been busy since I met you." Taizion narrowed his eyes and looked at him. "Now that you've come back alive, you must be even busier." "Busy attending the press conference, busy going to Philadelphia to meet the old man, and busy taking care of that little girl in the future. You don't need to worry about my matters. You just need to worry about your own trivial matters." "Just now, lawyer, he said that we're facing a big problem now. This trivial matter is really difficult to deal with. What I'm most afraid of is that we have the qualifications to deal with this matter. According to the Federation's laws, there are many problems." Taizion suddenly smiled and said, "Back then, Zhonglao who pushed that good-for-nothing Erlang to the forefront. It was a very old-fashioned but very wise method. Unfortunately, I'm afraid he didn't expect to die so early and so suddenly. Otherwise, the situation of the Zhong family in the Westwoods wouldn't be in such a mess now." "It's indeed a mess." Sulu thought of the hearing that was about to begin at the Supreme Court of the Federation and the elders of the Zhong family who were rushing over from the West Woods. He frowned deeply. "But you don't have to worry about anything. I've already arranged everything that needs to be arranged." Taizion slowly took a sip of red wine, then took out a few pills from his jacket pocket and swallowed them. "You're still taking pills? Red wine is bad for your health." Sulu shrugged and said, "Since you want to go back and be the crown prince, It's better for you not to get involved in the matters here. You don't believe that I can arrange it? Taizion looked at him with a faint smile. Sulu said in confusion, no lawyer dares to take over. And there's that damn custody battle. You already have arrangements? Although I haven't been as dazzling as you, Sulu, in my short youth, anyone who has come into contact with me would never dare to deny my excellence. Lai Zion looked at him with a smile. You're the only one who doesn't seem to have thought about this. Instead, you're used to treating me as someone to be protected. Do you know that this feeling is equivalent to humiliation for a man? Sulu was stunned. He carefully thought back on their friendship over the years and realized that what Taizion said was not wrong. He smiled a little embarrassedly, scratched his head, and said, your body is weak, so you're used to it. Don't forget, I was also an outstanding soldier in the army. In the Federation's military assessment, my total score was the highest. My estimated score was even higher than Zhou Yu's. Taizion narrowed his eyes and stared at Su Li's face. Like a stubborn youth who was competing to see who could climb the fastest in the forest, he said mockingly, this lawsuit will take at least 3 months, but I can tell you the result now. As long as Justice Hiying doesn't die of old age, that little girl of yours will definitely win. You're that confident? Sulu stared at him. Of course. Lai Zion gently coughed twice, then drank a mouthful of red wine that was brighter than blood. After a moment of silence he smiled and said, I'm best at analyzing people. If you have analyzed Chief Judge Hiying, you will know the reason. What reason? The old judge likes beautiful girls. Taizion looked into his eyes seriously and said word by word, on the west side of Robbie Avenue in the Capital Special District was a green forest. Even though it was winter, this building complex, which covered an area of about 6 square kilometers, was still shrouded in a solemn yet lively atmosphere formed by pine and cypress. The statue of the scales that represented fairness was in the corner of the building, supporting the pure white snow. The stone first charter ceremony was faintly discernible at the end of the forest. The Supreme Court of the Federation and its 3 subordinate procedural courts, as well as the 2 levels of circuit courts that were set up here due to historical reasons, were in this forest in this historical building complex. For the citizens of the Federation, this place represented fairness, justice, and the most important law. In the spacious second courtroom, the sunlight shone in through the huge glass window more than 10 meters high, illuminating the dozens of rows of pure black seats in the courtroom. However, lawyer Xiao Wenjing, who was sitting in the front seat, had an unusually gloomy expression. At this moment, in the gallery of the second courtroom, there were 17 founding members of the Zhong family who came all the way from the West Woods. Sitting in the front seat was the second young master of the Zhong family, Zhong Ziki, and in front of them was a terrifying legal team composed of 24 famous lawyers of the Federation. There were only 3 people on Xiao Wenjing's side. One was himself, one was a harmless fat man who looked like a big white steamed bun, and one was a cute and innocent little girl who looked like she was carved out of ice. The huge difference in the number of people on both sides clearly reflected the serious situation he was facing at this moment. The Shizhou law firm, which was said to have a very deep background, withdrew from this family property lawsuit that shocked the Federation for unknown reasons. And the most outstanding lawyer in the Federation, he was forced to leave the legal team in the old house of the Zhong family for well-known reasons. Under the pressure of those big families, under the vague hints of the Federation government, no law firm dared to take over this case. When Xiao Wenjing received the agency contract, he couldn't help but doubt his eyes. His beautiful new wife, Su Songzi, had a deep and worried talk with him all night, but there was no way to overturn his decision. Xiao Wenjing's teachers and classmates were all over the legal system. Even though no one was willing to stand in front of the stage to help him, there was still a lot of information secretly gathered in his hands. Although he was facing the most terrifying legal team in the Federation, he still had the confidence to fight this case. More importantly, he was now lawyer Xiao Wenjing. A few years ago, he was the most famous prosecutor Xiao Wenjing in the district prosecutor's office. He had once assisted his teacher in presiding over the investigation of the Medellin project. Even when the Federation government shamelessly compromised for benefits, he still tried to continue his own investigation in secret. It was just that in the evening of that day, he was put in prison by several Federation Investigation Bureau officials on the charge of molesting a young girl, At that time, prosecutor Xiao Wenjing didn't know if he thought of the words that the small-eyed man named Su Lu once said to him in a spring in full bloom, those words about law and morality. But Xiao Wenjing didn't give up his respect for the law. He left the district prosecutor's office and became a truly independent lawyer. Today, he was going to fight a case that was destined to go down in history for the Westwoods orphan. Chapter 680. The trial in the Second Court of Justice was not as intense as it was often described in literary works. Countless words full of traps and ambushes were floating in the courtroom, and the parties involved were blaming each other with bulging veins or crying tears and snot. On the contrary, the trial process was very dry and even boring. During the dull process of proof and defense, both lawyers' tones were strictly controlled within a certain range. Xiao Wenjing, who was under great pressure, looked gloomy and spoke slowly. She gave a very detailed description of the trial procedures, the scope of proof, and other technical aspects. In the quiet courtroom, other than the monotonous voices of the lawyers, there was only the rustling of the pages of the thick legal documents. Occasionally, there would be a few coughs and the sound of crutches moving on the wooden floor. There were more than a dozen old men from the Zhong family who came from the Westwoods sitting in the gallery. These old men were probably more than 80 years old. Almost every one of them had a crutch. Their chests had been hollowed out by the passage of time, and there was nothing but thick sputum and bellows-like emptiness in their chests and abdomens. The old men of the Zhong family watched everything in the court with indifferent expressions. They seemed to be perfectly playing the role of elders or wise men in the family. However, the tiredness and faint annoyance in the corners of their old eyes had already exposed their true feelings. The internal strife in the Westwoods, the Federation government and the other 6 ruthless families took advantage of the situation to infiltrate the Zhong family. The Zhong family was forced to retreat and was in a mess. These old men were all smart people. How could they not know that there was a hidden danger? It was a pity that everyone had greed. The closer they were to death, the stronger this kind of greed was. If Mrs. Zhong was still alive after the explosion of the ancient bell, these old men would not have dared to have any ambitions. However, the powerful couple died at the same time, leaving only an orphan daughter. What was even more amazing was that Mr. Zhong, who had always been considered the successor of the Westwoods, was also an orphan. Facing an orphan facing such a huge property and power, how could they not be tempted? Therefore, these old men of the Zhong family with crutches made a fatal mistake. They knew that there was no possibility of redeeming it. The strong thin tiger had died, and they tried to ride it. How could there be a day when they could get off it? The little girl who looked like she was carved out of ice and jade sat in front of the courtroom. She lowered her head and quietly did her homework. She looked innocent and harmless, but at this moment she was in court. This kind of silence and calmness seemed to represent some kind of indifference and coldness. Behind the little girl stood 2 crazy and powerful soldiers, Su Lu and Li Feng. If she grew up and the 2 crazy and powerful soldiers became even more powerful, how could these old men live? Would the smooth and cold crutches in his hand break into countless pieces? Therefore, even though they knew that the lawsuit would attract countless sharks from the capital ring for West Zhong and the Zhong family, the old men had to hold on until they won a Pyrrhic victory. Then they would bargain with the Federation and find a chance to catch their last breath. After a boring retelling of the legal provisions and objections, the lawyers of both sides in the court began to touch on the core of the topic. In order to fight for the custody of the little girl, the relevant evidence and verbal cross-examination became serious. After Zhong Ziki affectionately called for family affection, the opposing team directly focused on the big stick Tian. A famous master of the Federation, Lu Pingjing, raised an objection. He believed that an outsider who had no blood relationship with the Zhong family and no legal authority had no right to be the representative of the young lady of the Zhong family and sit in the courtroom. The heart-wrenching family disputes in the past year or so were some outsiders deceiving the young lady of the Zhong family for some unspeakable purpose. There are more than a dozen old men in the gallery. Some are state councillors, some are district councillors, and some are old generals. They have 2 things in common, and that is, they are all respected old men. They are all old men of the Zhong family. The famous lawyer of the Federation glanced at Xiao Wenjing coldly and continued, "My client, Zhong Ziki, is Zhong Huiyan's cousin. After Commander Zhong and his wife died for the country, he is the closest relative of Miss Zhong Huiyan. As for Mr. Tian, with all due respect, I don't have a good impression of your name at all. According to the public military records in your resume, I think you are completely unqualified to be the guardian of a little girl. A man who was expelled from the army because he beat up an officer, a man whose school status was temporarily suspended because he visited a prostitute, and a middle-aged man who has no complete family, drinks like crazy, and is very unhealthy. For a little girl who has lost her parents, deserves sympathy, and needs to be more worried about her psychological state, it is not a matter of whether he can be her guardian. I think the court should issue a restraining order to prohibit him from getting close to Miss Zhong Huiyan. Hearing this, Fatty Tian, who has been sitting on the table listlessly, finally raised his head. His narrowed eyes were like a torn steamed bun, with black bean paste slowly flowing out of his eyes. It was extremely cold and sharp. Macho Back Mountain had made his attitude clear. The Crown Prince left, and the Shizhou law firm terminated the agency. Mr. Tian knew very well that this case was very difficult to win, and he would definitely lose. Even though he had high hopes for the small-eyed young man who had just gone to his hometown, he still had no confidence. However, Mr. Tian actually didn't care too much about the outcome of the case. So what if the huge Guzhong company and the huge family property were all taken away by these old bastards? But he couldn't give the miss to them. If things really got to the point of no return, it would just be a mutiny in the Westwood Sunset Province. He would kill all the ungrateful relatives of the Zhong family, and then take the mist through the Dark Night Scorpion Nebula to Bermuda, which was beyond the control of the shameless Federation. He would wait for the mist to grow up, and wait for the small-eyed man and the little lunatic to become the most powerful men in the Federation. At that time he would take the mist back and take back the things that originally belonged to us.mr. Tian could think like this because he was a man with such a character, but Mr. Xiao Wenjing would never think like this. He picked up the handkerchief in front of him, gently wiped the sweat stains on his earlobes, and calmly continued to raise his doubts. He once again mentioned the 7th supplementary clause of the law on the estate of the Federation, as well as the precedents in several famous family property cases in the past 100 years. He believed that when the relatives who raised the relevant rights had obvious conflicts of interest with the guardianship, the relevant rights should not be protected in advance. Very clear legal provisions and precedents. Xiao Wenjing believed that the high and mighty middle-aged female judge would not raise any objection. However, just as he was thinking about this, the female judge with old-fashioned curly hair said coldly, "For the trial of a guardianship case, we first consider the growth environment and possibilities of the person who has no civil capacity. As for the personal wishes of the person who has no civil capacity, it's just a reference. Mr. Xiao, it will be difficult for you to convince me that the little girl sitting beside you does not need the guardianship of her own family, but needs this Mr. Tian as her guardian. As for the related conflicts of interest, I need evidence, not you using the news reports of the Federation and repeating them over and over again." The middle-aged female judge frowned as she looked at Xiao Wenjing. Her fingers tapped on the trial table, and she said unhappily, "This case has dragged on for more than a year. How much tax money has been wasted? The Federation's judicial system can no longer afford to waste too much judicial costs because of your delaying policy. I hope to get a result as soon as possible, so I hope you can present some substantial evidence." Xiao Wenjing's fingers froze in the middle of flipping through the case file. He raised his head to look at the curly-haired female judge, very confused and shocked by what she said. Substantial evidence? Did someone from the Zhong family attempt to murder Zhong Huiyan on the space station count as evidence? Did the unusual troop movement in the Westwood Sunset State more than a year ago count as evidence? No, these could not be used as evidence in court. Once he did, he would immediately be sued for slander. Thinking of this, a mocking and disgusted smile appeared on Mr. Zhao's face. He now had enough understanding of the darkness of the Federation's judicial system. He understood that the Federation government and the big families were determined to end the case of the Westwood's Zhong family before justice, He Ying's trial at all costs. Even if the curly-haired female judge behaved so stupidly and absurdly, as long as the trial process did not reach the Supreme Court, Justice He Ying would not be able to influence it even if she had other opinions. He was about to raise his voice to protest, but he caught a glimpse of the little girl's figure next to him. He thought of the things his colleagues at the Ministry of Justice were preparing, so he suppressed the anger in his heart and slowly sat down. Her black hair was smooth and neat as it rested quietly on the little girl's forehead. Zhong Huiyan, who was in the center of the whirlpool, did not seem to care about this important lawsuit that would determine her guardianship. She just lowered her head, held a thin digital pen, and seriously did her homework. When she encountered a difficult problem, she would cutely bite the pen. The cold, curly-haired middle-aged female judge, those old men with crutches, and that cousin who was acting like a family member were not in the little girl's eyes. The cold light of the winter sun shone down from the dome. The straight passage in the court appeared slightly dim. The heavy door was pushed open, and in this dim light, a straight figure walked in. His military boots made a clear sound as he stepped on the floor. Each sound was like stepping on the hearts of many people. The figure was getting closer and closer, and his face was getting clearer and clearer. Mr. Tian stood up and turned his head. The old men of the Zhong family on the side of the court suddenly tensed up, and Zhong Ziqi's eyes suddenly flashed with a few traces of fear. The figure walked to the front of the court, took off his military cap and slowly put it on the table. He passed a chip to the court clerk to play it. In the strange absolute silence in the court, he said to the female judge on the high platform, "My name is Su Lu, currently the Deputy Technical Supervisor of the 17th Mechanic Division of the Federation's 1st Military Region. I have entrusted lawyer Xiao Wenjing to submit my application for rights. I apply for full guardianship of Zhong Huiyan." Chapter 681. Su Lu walked into the courtroom and said a single sentence, eliciting many different reactions from the people in the courtroom. Some were speechless, some were silent like gold, and some were excited like boiling water. These reactions came from the clear meaning and strong emotions expressed in his words, and even more so from his name and surname. This name and figure already had too many meanings in the current federation. The expression of the high and mighty middle-aged female judge was still calm, carrying the indifference unique to Federation high-ranking judges. However, the gradually clenched right hand under the judge's robe betrayed her true emotions at this moment. Looking at the young Federation colonel below the stage, the female judge subconsciously leaned forward slightly, but was unwilling to look at him, only casting a questioning gaze towards Xiao Wenjing. Colonel Su Li's identity today is a special witness and temporary rights holder. Regarding his application to appear in court, our side has already sent in the documents last night. Xiao Wenjing's mood was extremely relaxed right now, looking at the female judge on the stage with a trace of ridicule, speaking unhurriedly and unhurriedly. The middle-aged female judge quickly flipped through the case file, discovering that the Zhong family's old residence's legal team did indeed request for a temporary witness last night. But, these damned bastards actually deliberately hiding the name of this witness, what are they trying to do? Are they trying to surprise me? If it was a normal military officer requesting to become the guardian of the little princess of the Zhong family, she, who was already famous within the Federation's legal system, wouldn't even bat an eyelid, and might even directly expel the other party for contempt of court. However, she couldn't do that right now because the young Federation colonel below the stage, or more accurately the youngest Federation colonel, was Colonel Su Lu. This custody case had always been proceeding according to the established process and plan, but who would have thought that Su Lu would suddenly appear in court, and moreover, he made an unexpected request for authority. The female judge's mood was gloomy and restless, thinking about the news that the Federation's news media had been broadcasting non-stop these past few days, thinking about the Federation's military godly Pifu shaking hands with Colonel Su Lu on the screen. Her hands couldn't help but tremble as she flipped through the case file. Yes, the Federation's legal system was absolutely independent. Even that old man in Philadelphia couldn't do anything to influence the court's judgment, but people knew that, other than the many years old Supreme Judge He Ying, the so-called judicial independence was more like a joke. If the court could really be completely independent of the Federation society, then why would she appear on the stage today, and say so many cold words before? I object. In the strange silence in the courtroom, The lawyers on the other side finally reacted after a short period of tense negotiations. The Federation's leading civil law lawyer stood up, nervously wiped the sweat on his forehead, and loudly said, "This is not in accordance with the case procedure. The name list of the claimants has been submitted 14 days ago. According to the relevant rules of the Federation's civil procedure law, anyone who objects to the claim of authority must submit the relevant evidence and application within 5 days before the trial. But whether it's in court or us, we haven't seen the application yet." When saying this, the lawyer didn't even turn his head to look at Su Lu. Not sure if it was because he felt that his reasons were sufficient and didn't need to be too aggressive, or because he didn't dare to look at Su Lu. Xiao Wenjing stood up, looked at the lawyer, and said, "According to the supplementary provisions of the procedural law, if there is a reason that is not beyond human power, then the date can be extended appropriately. Is there any reason that human strength cannot contend against?" The lawyer finally turned his head and looked over. When his eyes fell on Su Lu, he subconsciously nodded slightly in agreement. When the name list of the claimants was submitted, Colonel Su Lu, who is my second client, was on his way back to the Federation from the Empire with great difficulty. Naturally, he couldn't have known that the Federation had a trial that involved his interests. I believe that everyone who has seen the news is very clear on this point, so I won't add any more. Xiao Wenjing swept her gaze over the people in the courtroom and said, "I believe that no one will object to this reason." Of course no one would object. After experiencing the live broadcast of the escape of thousands of miles, the Federation Society would no longer allow anyone to object to Colonel Su Li's words. There was a wave of nervous discussion in the seats on the other side of the courtroom. They had no choice but to accept this explanation. After a series of arguments that rose and fell, the enormous group of lawyers behind Zhong Ziki finally came to a consensus. The lead lawyer, who had been silent all this time, slowly stood up and bowed his head to the female judge and Su Lu respectively. Then he said, "We agree, but because there is a new claimant we need time to prepare. Court will be adjourned for half an hour." The female judge rubbed her forehead and said, "Because the original surveillance file is in the Department of Defense's archives, it's very troublesome to retrieve it, so we came a bit late." Su Lu said to Xiao Wenjing, "I hope there won't be any problems. If we want to obtain evidence through the court, it will definitely take a long time. We don't have time to waste with the other party for too long." Xiao Wenjing smiled and said, "Since you have already brought it over, no matter what the other party does, this custody case will still be fought." Hearing this, Su Li's eyes narrowed. He knew what Xiao Wenjing meant by time. Only by winning the custody case could they take the family property case to the Supreme Court and in front of Justice He Ying. Although he did not believe that the old justice would definitely give them the victory, at least he believed in the old man's wisdom and judicial spirit. However, Justice He Ying was so old that she could die at any time, so they needed time. Thinking of this, he could not help but think of the old man in Philadelphia, and his heart became a little heavy. According to Taizion's arrangement, he had been discussing with Xiao Wenjing and the lawyers behind her for the past 2 nights. Zhong Ziki and those old men were trying to regain the custody of Zhong Huayan, so that they could fully obtain the ownership of the Zhong family's property. This move was really vicious and even made people feel a little desperate, because whether it was Fatty Tian or the old people in the Westwoods trusted by Commander Zhong, they were not related to Zhong Huayan by blood. However, at this time lawyer He, who was forced to give up the defense, thought of a somewhat whimsical but absolutely earth-shattering idea. Let Su Lu come forward to fight for the custody. Letting Su Lu come forward to fight for the custody seemed to be no different from other people, because he was not related to the Zhong family in the Westwoods. However, after lawyer He's analysis, Xiao Wenjing and those former colleagues who secretly helped him were shocked to find that Su Lu was indeed the best choice. More importantly, Su Lu had an innate advantage that no one could compare with. It seems that something has changed. Why didn't anyone tell me? Fatty Tian looked at Su Lu with a smile and patted him on the shoulder. It seems that you want to take my job as your godfather? You don't want to? Su Lu looked at this old friend who he had not seen for a long time, and his mood was slightly shaken. He bent down and hugged him, saying, "Long time no see." At this time the little girl, who had been quietly sitting at the table with her head down to do her homework, finally moved. The digital pen in her fingers fell on the table, making a soft sound. Then she turned around, and her soft and neat black hair swayed with a bang, like a cute jumping watermelon skin. Zhong Huiyan, who was already 11 years old, stood up. Her eyes were as bright as stars, and she looked at Su Lu without blinking. Her black hair was on her shoulders, and old dolls were behind her. She exuded a kind of aura called choo-choo, just like 6 years ago beside the huge porthole in Area 32 of the ancient bell. It seemed that she had not changed at all. But after all, a lot had changed. The little girl who had lost her parents had finally grown up. She stared at Su Lu with her round eyes, stubbornly pursed her pink lips, and puffed out her cheeks. After staring at Su Lu for a long time, she shouted, "Didn't you say that you don't care about me anymore?" Su Lu was stunned. He quietly looked at the little girl who was about to reach his chest. He did not know why, but his heart was filled with infinite fatherly love. He rudely reached out and interrupted the little watermelon's anger. He carelessly tore her neat black hair and said in a deep voice, "Don't talk nonsense." Zhong Huiyan shook her head angrily like a small animal. She wanted to shake off the big hand, but found that it was somewhat futile. She said angrily, "Then will you still leave in the future?" "Not anymore." "Liar. Why would I lie to you? I'm going to be your guardian soon. Then you have to win the case. Don't worry. The case of the Zhong family in the Westwood seemed to be going on for several years. If they did not fight until the end of time, the truth would not come to light. Because of the background power of both sides, in the beginning of the custody battle, they fell into an almost tragic battle. This kind of tragedy did not refer to the sort of words that could be seen in the court, but the allocation of resources and tricks that were hidden behind the scenes. And Su Li's appearance was undoubtedly the most powerful and fatal blow to the old house of the Zhong family. After half an hour of intense discussion, the huge group of lawyers that served the old masters of the Zhong family drafted a response. Due to the current environment of the Federation in the midst of war, the group of lawyers did not raise any doubts about Su Li's personal character. They only insisted that he had nothing to do with this custody case. And the relatives of the Zhong family who appeared one after another as witnesses put on a touching drama of the bitterness of the rich family. Xiao Wenjing's lawyer Su Lu and the others had been watching silently and did not care. When it was their turn to speak, Xiao Wenjing stood up and said calmly, after listening to the many doubts of the other side, "I have not heard anyone questioning the personal character of Colonel Su Lu. This shows that no one has been blinded by interests and presumptuously slandered him. Designing MX, exposing the plagiarism of the Federal Academy of Science, leading Group 7 to take on the most dangerous mission at the front line, venturing deep into the territory of the Empire." Over the years, Su Lu had done so many things. Not only did it mean that he had done something for the Federation, but more importantly, from these things it could be seen what kind of person he was. Of course, if Su Lu was a small figure, then even if he was the most standard moral model, in the eyes of the lawyers of the Federation, he would be a villain who committed all kinds of crimes. But in today's Federation, who could and dared to question Su Li's personal character? As a guardian, I think the judge and all of you know very well what kind of moral quality and personal background one should have. Then, without a doubt, Colonel Su Lu is the most suitable candidate to be Zhong Huiyan's guardian. And don't forget, after Commander Zhong and his wife were murdered by the people of the Empire, who risked his life to avenge them. At this time, the leading lawyer with a full beard stood up and looked calmly at the female judge. Just as the opposing lawyer said, "No one will question Colonel Su Li's personal character, but I would like to remind the judge and the opposing lawyer that we are discussing the issue of guardianship today, not the issue of a moral model. If one can become a guardian because they are suitable, then wouldn't it mean that all the children in the Federation who have doubts about their guardianship should apply to be Colonel Su Li's guardian?" The middle-aged female judge's eyelids lifted slightly. She knew that the leading lawyer was hinting at which angle she should judge from, and her mood was slightly relieved. The leading lawyer turned to look at Xiao Wenjing and continued, "If that's the case, then I think Zhong Huiyan's guardian should be Lord War God. The spirit of the Federation's law regarding child guardianship has always been the most important. Even if Colonel Su Lu is the most suitable guardian candidate, he does not have any special relationship with Zhong Huiyan. He has nothing to do with this entire matter. If you don't object, I have no objection. Xiao Wenjing shrugged and said with a smile, of course, you and I both know that this is just a joke, but can I interpret it this way? If there is evidence that Colonel Sulu is related to this guardianship battle, then he is the most suitable candidate? The leading lawyer lowered his eyes slightly and felt a trace of strangeness. However, at this moment he carefully recalled the records in the file. Although Sulu seemed to have some contact with Commander Zhong and his wife, there was no direct evidence that he could intervene in the guardianship battle. After pondering for a moment, he smiled and said, "You can interpret it that way." "Very good." Xiao Wenjing said, "Just now, Colonel Sulu took an audio file and submitted it to the court. Because of the adjournment, no one had a chance to listen to it. At this time, should everyone listen to it?" In the quiet courtroom, there was a slight electronic noise and the sound of explosions in the distance. Everyone listened silently and attentively. Then they heard a man's deep voice. Although the man was at the end of his life, his voice was still so clear and calm. "Is Sulu here?" "Commander, I'm here. Help me take care of Huiyan." "Yes." Chapter 682. That doesn't prove anything. The leading lawyer with a thick beard stood up abruptly. The worry in the corner of his eyes instantly turned into a strong automatic stress reaction. His voice was twisted and crushed until it was extremely sharp. He waved his arms and shouted loudly in the courtroom. The audio that was played earlier, the audio that had been kept by the Department of Defense for more than a year and had enough authorization, explained a certain problem. Deducing from that, it could completely destroy all of the confidence of the Zhong family's old master and the second young master, and it could turn the most terrifying legal team in the Federation into a pile of dog shit. That was why their reaction was so real and primitive. They were screaming and pounding their chests like children who had their lollipop stolen. Xiao Wenjing didn't care about the reaction of the legal team at all. She didn't even see the dozen or so lawyers standing up abruptly. She looked at the female judge in the courtroom and said calmly, "All the soldiers of the new 17th Division on the Monolith battleship, and the relevant soldiers of the Federal Fleet can all prove that Commander Zhong gave his daughter to Sulu before he sacrificed himself." Zhong Ziqi's expression was gloomy. The Zhong family's old masters stomped their crutches angrily. No one knew what emotions were hidden under the female judge's indifferent expression. Xiao Wenjing raised her eyebrows slightly and continued calmly, "President Pabre also listened to this audio file as soon as possible. I don't think anyone can doubt the authenticity of this audio file, so I implore your honor to confirm this evidence as soon as possible and complete the judgment of this authorization case through a simple procedure based on this evidence. The time and cost of the Federation's legal system shouldn't be wasted by us." Xiao Wenjing said very seriously. The two sentences seemed normal, but to the high and mighty female judge, it was undoubtedly the most blatant slap in the face. The slap made the blood vessels on her face gradually disappear, and it was bruised and swollen. She looked extremely pathetic and shameful. The female judge was silent. She looked at the case file under her eyes. She glanced at the dark shadows in the courtroom seats from the corner of her eyes, waiting for some people to express their opinions or support. Take care of? This is a term commonly used in interpersonal relationships. The outer meaning of the term is too vague, and it definitely can't prove that this is related to the transfer of guardianship authority. According to our opinion, the bearded leading lawyer wiped the sweat on his forehead and said in a deep voice. Xiao Wenjing interrupted, "I can accept your doubts, but it doesn't mean much to the court's judgment." Behind the packed seats in the courtroom, in a dark corner that didn't attract too much attention, there were about a dozen seemingly normal people listening in. However, in reality, everyone knew who these 10 or so people represented. They represented the Federation government, the military, and those few terrifying families. This was not a secret, or rather, they had never thought that it could become a secret. The man in the round hat at the back was Brin, the director of the Office of the President's Residence. Even he had come, let alone the rest. After Sulu appeared in court, Director Brin had been hiding his face in the shadows. He seemed to have made a phone call halfway through. Overall, he did not express any inclination that could be grasped by the two parties involved in the dispute between the Westwoods Zhong family. At this moment, when the curly-haired middle-aged female judge looked at Director Brin, What she saw was still an ordinary face with most of his eyes and brows covered by the brim of his hat. I agree with Lawyer Wan's opinion. This audio file can't prove. The female judge glanced at the people in the courtroom and opened her mouth a little nervously. Sulu didn't think that there would actually be someone in the Federation who dared to do something so ugly and arrogant. Hearing the judge's words, his eyes gradually narrowed. His pair of thick, ink-like eyebrows gradually rose. The austere aura contained in the colonel's military uniform gradually thickened, turning into a kind of almost real pressure that pervaded and shook the spacious courtroom space. Commander Zhong's last words before he sacrificed himself for the country. Can't it show his intentions? Xiao Wenjing stared at the judge, angry because of the absurdity. She said sternly, Your Excellency, I don't know if this opinion of yours can be accepted by the soldiers of the West Woods. If it can be accepted by the federal forces. There was a suffocating silence. The female judge raised her thin eyebrows, stared at Xiao Wenjing, and scolded with a sharp and slightly trembling voice, Are you threatening the court? Xiao Wenjing didn't answer this stern question. Sulu, who had been silent for a while, slowly raised his head, stared at the high and mighty female judge, and asked, Yes, so what? The courtroom was in an uproar, and the team of lawyers seized the opportunity to start acting out a show of public passion. Old Master Zhong and Zhong Ziki slightly pursed their lips, feeling that things seemed to be getting more and more interesting. However, no one noticed that the female judge, who carried the collective will of the Federation, had her eyes quietly falling on Director Brin's body in the shadows. The dim light scattered on Director Brin's body. This big shot who wasn't very old indifferently lowered his head, as if he didn't care about the judgment in the courtroom at all. He was minding his own business, fiddling with a high-class encrypted phone, and no one knew who he was contacting. The female judge's heart suddenly froze by a lot. I announce that Colonel Sulu has obtained the custody of Zhong Huayan, citizen number XLAS 210-300-1213. They won. Sulu, Xiao Wenjing and Fatty Tian hugged the staff with slightly excited enthusiasm. This was the power of the combination of debate strategy and strange evidence. From another point of view, this was the first demonstration of the valiant taste of the trial that was destined to last for a long time. The 11-year-old little watermelon, no, we should call her Zhong Huiyan, did not jump up and down like a little girl. She jumped up with her feet in white socks at the same time and made scissors-like gestures with her hands. Instead, she looked up and smiled happily, her right hand tightly grasping Su Li's hand. The people from the Zhong family's old residence walked out of the courtroom and crossed the green field. After walking for about 700 meters, they arrived in front of the media interview area. Countless flashing lights clicked in the winter air, and microphones were pressed in front of them like gun barrels. Colonel Sulu, we would like to know the competition for the custody of Miss Zhong Huiyan. Does this represent the clear attitude of the Philadelphia government? Sulu held the little girl's hand tightly. He didn't let go, and he didn't want to let go. Facing countless news media of the Federation, he said seriously, No, this just represents my personal attitude. After a pause, he looked at the withered leaves in front of him and said slowly, And this can also represent the attitude of Colonel Li Feng. But I have to say that this is just our personal attitude, and it has nothing to do with the army god. In the final analysis, this is the attitude of Commander Zhong before he died. He said seriously, I respect this point, and I will practice it to the end. Chapter 683. For the ordinary people of the Federation, such as Su Lu, who was beside the Donglin mine many years ago, the so-called seven great families were some kind of mysterious and lofty existence that only existed in legends. They did not know which seven great families stood at the top of human society, and had stood there for thousands of years. Relatively speaking, the media reporters who had access to the relevant secrets might be able to clearly list the names of the seven great families. However, due to the almost instinctive awe and some kind of tacit understanding that had been passed down for thousands of years, no media dared to report in depth on the illustrious history of the seven great families and the dazzling present day of the seven great families. Only the Zhong family in the Westwoods was an exception. From the time they opened up the Donglin mine many years ago to the time they were exiled to the far west Star region, this family that held military power and was almost like a separatist warlord had always been in the eyes of the people of the Federation. They were in the spotlight of the news media, just like the scene flashing in front of the court at this time. News about the Zhong family, especially such an explosive news about the custody of the little princess of the Zhong family, no professionally trained reporter would be stupid enough to miss it. And when they found out that the final victor, who was holding the little princess of the Zhong family, walking along the quiet snowy road from the direction of the court, was actually Colonel Su Lu, they realized that this news turned out to be more explosive than they had imagined. Holding Zhong Huiyan's cold little hand that was a little stiff because of nervousness, Su Lu calmly answered the questions of the reporters. The details of what happened in the court did not require him to retell the story to satisfy the interest of the general public, but he tried to understand some of the things behind the scenes of this lawsuit through his own words. He tried his best not to let people misunderstand the intentions of the old man in Philadelphia. After a brief answer, the group turned around and left. He held Zhong Huiyan's hand and walked to the side of the motorcade. When he was about to board the car, a familiar figure suddenly came into view. After a slight pause, he handed Zhong Huiyan to Mr. Tian and whispered a few words. The black motorcade slowly drove away. The elite special forces loyal to the Zhong family's old mansion escorted their princess away from the noisy and chaotic scene. Su Lu was not worried about little Watermelon's safety. With the protection of these powerful Westwood soldiers who had been on the battlefield for a long time, as well as the terrifying Uncle Tian by his side, Su Lu did not notice that in the second bulletproof sedan, Colonel Lake, the direct commander of the Westwood's troops, was slowly taking off the sunglasses on his nose. His eyes were looking through the tinted windows at Su Li's silhouette as he stood above the snow. He was deep in thought. After watching the convoy leave, Su Lu turned around to look for that familiar figure, but he saw Director Brin, who was wearing a hat, walking in front of him. "I don't think your actions today are rational." Director Brin put his right hand in the pocket of his windbreaker and held the high-class encrypted phone. He looked at Su Li's face and said with a serious expression, "Or for such an important action, you should have handled it more carefully. For example, you should have informed me in advance." Su Lu was silent for a moment, choosing his words carefully. Although the seemingly ordinary official in front of him did not have a high rank, the entire Federation knew that on certain occasions, he could represent President Pabre's attitude. No one dared to look down on him. Today, Director Brin came to the court to monitor the progress of this major event on behalf of Mr. President. For the man in the official residence, the Federation needed a united rear. He wanted the Westwoods incident to be resolved as soon as possible. He wanted the government to strengthen its control over the Westwoods, which was the situation he wanted to see the most. Su Li's sudden intervention could even represent the will of the old man in Philadelphia. It would only make this matter more complicated and drag on, which would be more disadvantageous to the Federation. "If there is a chance, I will personally solve this matter with Mr. President," Su Lu replied. Director Brin paused for a moment, frowned slightly and said, "Mr. President has been very busy recently, but I will clearly convey your message to him. Also, if there is a chance, please send my regards to the old man." Okay. Director Brin left, and so did the representatives of the several major families. The old man of the Zhong family, with a gloomy expression, and Zhong Ziki, who had an even gloomier expression, also took separate vehicles and left this solemn place surrounded by green trees. The reporters in the distance keenly noticed that when the Zhong family left, the motorcade actually took a big detour and avoided the place where Colonel Su Lu was standing. It seemed that they did not even want to pass by Su Lu. The phone rang. It was Zhou Yu on the other end. Su Lu smiled and picked up the phone. At the same time, he quickened his pace and walked towards the dark shadow behind the tree. "I saw the news. Congratulations on becoming the godfather of the little princess of the Zhong family." From this sentence with a strong sense of sarcasm, it was obvious that Zhou Yu was not in a good mood at the moment. Without waiting for Su Lu to answer, she opened her mouth and said sharply, "Regarding the matter of the Westwoods, every step you take toward what you think is victory is equivalent to stabbing a knife into the hearts of those big shots that you can't fight against. I know. Sulu answered very seriously into the phone, but I think I should be able to handle it. No matter how bad the situation is, it can't be worse than a few years ago. No. Zoyu said directly on the other end of the phone. You're just one person. You don't have soldiers, you don't have an army. You only have the rank of deputy commander and the reputation of a hero of the Federation. Since you've already started, then I have to remind you that the situation you're about to face is the worst situation ever. As soon as she finished speaking, the phone was hung up. Sulu stared blankly at the phone in his hand. He felt that even the busy tone had the unique coldness of the woman in red. He couldn't help but shrug self-deprecatingly. He looked at the handsome man in the shadow of the building behind the tree and said, "Now I gradually understand why you, who have always been successful in the matters between men and women, have never been able to win over the mother of your child." Shi Qinghai stubbed out his 37 brand cigarette with his fingers. He looked at the man in front of him, whom he hadn't seen for a long time. He thought they were separated by life and death, but he had reappeared in front of him. There was still a charming and hateful smile on his face. He said in a slightly hoarse voice, "Let's find a quiet place and have a few drinks first." In the simple tavern to the left of the South Bridge Gate of Yuan, the two men completed their reunion with 4 bottles of amber-colored liquor. They didn't sigh too much or exchange meaningless pleasantries for too long. Instead, they looked at each other in silence for a long time. They raised their glasses to each other and drank until their chests and abdomens burned with pain and happiness. Then they turned the emotions of the past year into tranquility. The alcohol was strong, but the two of them didn't continue in this small tavern. This was because this place was suitable for drinking, but it was still not the quietest place they needed. They casually left the black car in the parking lot and took the underground express line back to the apartment in Wangdu. The surveillance equipment in the apartment started up again. The two of them skillfully filtered the signal. After confirming that there was no possibility of being monitored, they sat down on the sofa. 2 glasses of water were placed on the table. Shi Qinghai and Sulu took out 2 lists of names at the same time and placed them beside the glasses. "Stone, this is what I found." Chapter 684. The transparent and colorless water remained stubbornly high in the cup. Since no one was drinking it, it refused to drop. However, there were a lot more cigarette butts in the ashtray. The burnt and twisted cigarette butts formed a weird mess. In the smoke-filled room, 2 people silently read the relevant information they had, and then raised their heads almost at the same time. This kind of scene was not strange to Sulu and Shi Qinghai. A few years ago, when Senator Macklin kidnapped countless people of the Federation under the banner of morality, one of them stayed in the grotesque modern society and watched coldly like a stone, preparing to smash the enemy. The other one hid in the dark and followed the clues of the past indifferently. They rarely contacted each other and did not cooperate, but they were very close to each other and welcomed the day of the final general attack. Today's scene was like the reincarnation preached by some religion in Bermuda, or maybe it was just a simple repetition. For people like Sulu and Shi Qinghai, their personalities determined their choices. Therefore, when the whole Federation was about to forget the assassination plot and the ancient bell that had turned into fireworks, they were still looking for the truth and asking for answers. In Linhai State Gymnasium, the 2nd Military Region assassinated Tai Ziyuan. Yang Jingsong committed suicide. Many people from the 2nd Military Region died. At that time I followed the gray sweater and found Macklin. However, there was another middleman behind this assassination. Shi Qinghai pursed his thin lips and took a deep puff. The cigarette suddenly lit up. The smoke was so dazzling that he had to squint his eyes. One could faintly see that his peach blossom eyes were bloodshot due to tiredness. "I've told you about this before. The middleman is an active military officer, at least a major. He has a head of reddish-brown hair. The force he represents is a senator." Regarding the assassination of the little princess of the Zhong family in Wood Valley Manor, after the government stopped the investigation, I entered the Federation Investigation Bureau and found some relevant information. The powerful gunman you stopped was not related to the 2nd Military Region. Now, I'm investigating this friend surnamed Chun. Before he was expelled from the military academy, Before he carried out the government's secret mission, I want to know who he was in close contact with. The most important thing is that the ancient bell was attacked. During the year you were in the Empire, I've been secretly investigating. Now, I can confirm that the seed of the Empire who died outside the military prison was indeed from the Empire. However, he did not have the opportunity to access this level of military secrets, let alone guide the Empire's fleet to the brilliant shadow in space. There's something very strange. The wreckage of the ancient bell was not allowed to drift in space as a memorial to the soldiers as usual. Instead, it was dragged back to the surface for further investigation. The problem is that the relevant departments did not drag it back to the West Woods. Instead, they dragged it back to the 23rd Research Institute of S2. Then it was quickly melted down. Shi Qinghai took out the cigarette and licked his bitter lips. He put out the cigarette and said with a smile, "But before it was melted down, I found a chance to take a look. I found that the escape system of the ancient bell had been tampered with beforehand. This also means that even if the clock commander did not choose to die in battle but chose to escape, there was no hope for him to survive. As the most outstanding intelligence officer of the Green Dragon Mountain anti-government army in recent years, Sulu wouldn't doubt young Master Shi's judgment. For a person who had the qualifications to enter the Trinity Association, in addition to the fact that that place was S2, even if he did something even more outrageous, it wouldn't be shocking. I don't have too many people on my list, but I suspect that they are all involved in this matter." Sulu gently bit the cigarette with his front teeth and leaned back on the soft sofa. He felt a little tired and continued, "The assassination of Taizion, the assassination of Little Watermelon, the assassination of Commander Zhong. If it was a series of actions as you speculated, then, how long did these people prepare?" The bloody battle in the Linhai State Gymnasium that Sulu would remember for the rest of his life was something that happened years ago. At that time, he thought that after the suicide of Deputy Minister Yang Jingsong and the arrest of more than 10 officers of the 2nd Military Region, the militants in the military had been wiped out. However, what happened later proved that the forces had been hiding deeper than people thought and had been preparing for a longer time. As for how terrifying the strength of those people were, Sulu did not express any feelings or doubts. No matter how strong or weak the enemy was, as long as they were the enemy, they would have to fight. I checked the list of all the members of the Management Committee of the Federation at that time and sorted them according to the suitable conditions. Together with the information from my sources, I made a list. And in this list, there are not many people who have the ability to influence the military. Shi Qinghai pointed to the first name on Sulu's list and said, "Vice President Byron is undoubtedly the most suspicious one." At that time, before he partnered with Pabre, he was a member of the Federation's Management Committee's Military Budget Director. In earlier years, he had served as the head of the General Staff Department of the 3rd Military Region of the Federation, a Major General. Very few Major Generals in the military would take off their military uniform and enter the political world and be successful, but Mr. Vice President has done it. The 3rd Military Region? Sulu thought of the famous general of the Federation who came from the 3rd Military Region, and couldn't help but frown deeply. After a moment of silence, he lit another cigarette and said with a hoarse voice, "I have never heard of Commander Shaoqing having any private contact with the Vice President. Also, there was a time difference. When Byron was the head of the General Staff Department, he shouldn't have been able to influence the Iron 7 Division. Don't worry so much. Let's first finalize the list and then adjust the direction." Shi Qinghai messed up his black hair. But he didn't know that he exposed a few strands of white hair behind his head. He said in a deep voice, "Vice President Byron, Assistant Director Cui Zhedong of the Bureau of Proclamation, the head of the relevant department of the Military Research Institute, the former Vice President who died of illness, the Mechanical Army of the 2nd Military Region, Du Shaoqing and his Iron 7 Division." Hearing this, Sulu raised his right hand and interrupted, "I don't have any evidence to support my suspicion of Du Shaoqing. Although he and Tiger have always been enemies, I always thought that this person wouldn't shoot someone in the back. Do you have evidence for the rest of the people on the list?" Shi Qinghai stared into his eyes and said, "If you had evidence to prove that the Vice President of the Federation is suspected of murdering the frontline Commander-in-Chief, then you wouldn't be sitting here. You would be in the president's residence. I don't have any judicial evidence for the names on this list, but I do have evidence that leads me to believe that they are involved in this matter. This sentence was a bit of a mouthful, because it involved the backtracking of the Federal Central Computer's database. Sulu couldn't explain it too clearly. Okay. Shi Qinghai spread his hands and said, I don't have evidence for Du Xiaoqing and his Iron 7 division, but I do have intuition. Let's not talk about this for now. Su Li's expression was a bit worried. He asked, You've been investigating for so long. Have you found out that those big families are involved in this matter? I don't know if I should say it's lucky or unlucky. There's no sign of this at the moment. Shi Qinghai said calmly, but this is very easy to understand. For the sake of benefits, the 7 big families can cooperate with any power. I even suspect that in the future, they can treat the emperor of the empire as a reliable trading partner. But they definitely won't cooperate with the radicals in the army. He looked at Sulu and said softly, when the politicians who control the administrative power of the Federation gain the loyalty of the radicals in the army, or even more frightening, when the radicals in the army gain the power of the Federation, this is the situation that the 7 big families fear the most, because this will shake the foundation of these families' survival. The only thing that can completely destroy the entangled interests and relationships that these families have spent tens of thousands of years to build, and those seemingly unshakable cornerstones, is violence. Absolute violence, violence that goes out of control. Then from this point of view, your Green Dragon Mountain should praise these radicals? Sulu said with a bit of sarcasm. Different paths lead to the same destination, but because of the different paths chosen, perhaps when people reach that destination, it will not be in the same season, and the color of the flowers on the mountainside will be very different. You are a spy, not a poet. In this type of exciting and impassioned turning point in history, the blood of violence, the despicable schemes, it is very easy to stir up the poetic feeling within everyone's heart. Sulu didn't pay him any attention. He just stared blankly at that list of names, counting from top to bottom. He thought about the power these names represented, and he suddenly felt his body become somewhat cold. He subconsciously said in a low voice, The Federation from top to bottom is about to rot. The Federation government from top to bottom has long rotted away. Shi Qinghai looked at him with ridicule, the cigarette between his fingers. This is something that Green Dragon Mountain has always been trying to tell people, but no one is willing to believe it. Sulu was silent. Suddenly, he looked at him very seriously and said, This time is different from the Macklin matter. This is an internal problem of the Federation government, and it doesn't have much to do with you. I know that your current situation isn't good. Green Dragon Mountain's committee seems to have completely forgotten about you. This liaison officer, and they haven't given you any support. You should not take any more risks and continue investigating. An outstanding intelligence officer should, and can only get used to working alone. Shi Qinghai seemed to have thought of something. His expression became somewhat desolate, and he said in a low voice, This is what that guy said. I heard that he's about to die of illness. In a few days I have to make a trip back to S2. If you have time, come with me. Okay. Sulu replied very quickly. Then he didn't forget what he was most worried about. He continued to stare into his eyes and said with a serious expression, Although I'm not a professional, it's more appropriate for me to investigate this matter. It's also safer. You have to promise me that you won't get involved in this matter. Shi Qinghai was silent for a moment. Then he revealed a smile. Hidden within that smile was a trace of a strange emotion. He stared into Su Li's eyes and asked with an incomparable seriousness, I indeed always believed that there was no one more professional than me, but I spent over a year to find these things. You've only just returned from the Empire a few days ago, and you've already come up with such a list. It truly makes me feel incomparably shocked. Unless you're a candidate for the head of the Bureau of Proclamation, it really is difficult to explain all of this. Sulu was silent. He didn't know what to say. Right at this time his phone rang. There was no number displayed on the screen. Director Breen's emotionless voice came from the other end of the phone. Colonel Sulu, Mr. President wants to see you. Chapter 686. On a certain New Year's Day in a certain bar, the two of them had once held a glass of hard liquor while looking at the back of a man wearing a windbreaker walking down the gangway of an old-fashioned transport plane. Amidst the cheering crowd, they had softly said, "To our president." Today on the sofa in Wangdu condominium, Sulu and Shi Qinghai looked at each other, picked up the glass of water on the table, and drank it in one gulp. They fell into a short silence and did not speak. They knew what each other was thinking. Could they trust the president that they had joked about? Calm down. Shi Qinghai put the glass of water on the table and broke the silence. Sulu nodded. Although they were not raised by political tactics, they had seen too much life and death on the battlefield. Naturally, they were not hot-blooded youths who would bet all their money on a seemingly honest person in a casino. But after all, this is not the Medellin incident. He frowned as he stared at the materials on the table and said, "As I said just now, this is a big problem within the Federation. We need help. Mr. President should be trustworthy. And don't forget, he has always admired you." He raised his head and looked at Shi Qinghai with a smile. "There are not many people who dare to admire you. But we will never be grateful just because someone appreciates us," Shi Qinghai replied with a smile. "Or rather, we don't need anyone's appreciation." Sulu stood up and walked into the bedroom to check the workbench in the black box. His voice came from behind the door, and there was some echo. He was very serious. "Don't forget what I said just now." There was a light beeping sound and there was a light blue light. Sulu stretched out his hands and accepted the strict security check, waiting for the authorization to monitor the network. He had been to this building that represented the highest authority in the Federation many times. He had long lost his initial excitement and frustration. He was so calm that he even felt a little numb. He had extra energy to look through the glass and look at the snowflakes outside the official residence. After completing the security check, he was taken to the Oval Office by the Special Task Force's security personnel. However, as soon as he stepped onto the expensive carpet in the side corridor of the office, the antique door in front of him was pushed open. More than a dozen high-ranking federal government officials surrounded the dark-skinned Mr. President and quickly walked to the end of the corridor. As they walked, the officials kept reporting. Mr. President's footsteps did not stop, and he nodded gently from time to show his agreement. Sulu looked in that direction, puzzled. If the president had something to deal with, when would he see him? Did he have to wait in the president's official residence for a day? At that moment, President Pabre suddenly stopped and asked Director Breen something in a deep voice. He then turned around and stared at Sulu at the end of the corridor and said loudly, "Follow me." Following the president's gaze and his order, the bustling interior of the official residence suddenly quieted down. All the officials in the official residence looked at the corner where Sulu was. When they saw that the officer was Sulu, they showed a look of understanding. Sulu was a little surprised. He carried the black workbench and quickly walked over. The staff surrounding President Pabre quickly made a path for him. When he got close, the president did not give him any instructions. He did not even exchange pleasantries. He walked straight out of the official residence with everyone, leaving only a simple word. "Let's go." "Where are we going?" Sulu looked at the president's shoulder and murmured subconsciously. "Parliament Hill," Director Breen said expressionlessly beside him. After a lively custody case in the morning, Sulu reunited with Mr. Shi. He drank a few bottles of liquor and gritted his teeth like a tabloid reporter who swore to uncover the secrets of the big shots of the Federation from a pile of shit. Then, he was summoned to the president's official residence by a phone call. He began to carry the heavy black leather suitcase and followed the president to many places and met many people. Because his brain was still affected by the alcohol, he did not know how to react for a while. Many years later, he still remembered the busy silence and frustration in the deep winter of the 71st year of the constitutional calendar. For a full 7 hours, Sulu accompanied President Pabre to participate in a heated debate in the Military Budget Committee on Parliament Hill. He attended 2 afternoon tea parties that he could not refuse. He had a fruitful conversation with the corporate members of the Four States Huanshan Foundation, but did not get a specific amount of money. He also attended a dinner party organized by the Veterans Association. At the party, the president gave a passionate speech, expressing his full appreciation and strong confidence for the performance of the federal forces on the front lines of the empire. At night, the president entered the building of the Ministry of National Defense and began to listen to the military's latest battle report. During the whole process, Sulu stood less than 2 meters away from the president, replacing the position of the security staff of the Special Task Force. He narrowed his eyes uncomfortably and vigilantly looked around at the charming smiles, the enthusiastic people, the shrewd members of parliament, and the enthusiastic veterans who stood up and cheered enthusiastically. Parliament Hill, Lufeng Slope Clubhouse, Shishan Hotel, and the Ministry of National Defense building. The motorcade hurriedly shuttled back and forth. Wherever President Prabal went, everyone would stand up in silence. Everyone lowered their heads to greet him. Many people also noticed Sulu behind Mr. President. Unknowingly, countless smiles were offered. Those who noticed this had endless doubts in their hearts. They did not understand why Mr. President would bring Colonel Sulu to these occasions. There were too many such occasions and too many journeys, so much so that even Sulu felt that his ankles were a little sore. His well-ironed colonel's uniform began to get wet, and his expressionless facial muscles began to stiffen, looking at the president in front of him, who was still full of energy, who shook hands with every officer of the Federation, and who still spoke in a deep and resonant voice. Sulu could not help but feel a lot of emotions. He felt extremely tired even when he was expressionless, so how could the president maintain a cheerful smile for an entire day? Standing behind the president in the most confidential war hall of the Department of Defense, Sulu put his hands behind his back and stood in an extremely standard posture. He did not pay attention to the puzzled gazes of the officers behind the glass door. His eyes behind the sunglasses narrowed slightly as he stared at President Pabal's tan neck and the few strands of white hair that dazzled his eyes. Time was indeed the most terrifying thing. Back then, the man who had won the support of the entire Federation with his charisma, and became the president of the Federation from a small lawyer, had entered the president's official residence for many years. In the end, he was still worn down by the busy political affairs and time. While guessing the real reason the president brought him everywhere, Sulu noticed that the president had changed. He had become thinner, which made the corners of his eyebrows appear taller and clearer. At the same time, Mr. Pabre was the most incisive orator when he was a lawyer and a member of parliament. Now that he had become the president, he had become a lot gentler and calmer. Although he was often silent, he gave people a feeling of strength. When they returned to the president's official residence that was covered in grass and snow, it was already close to the end. On the dining table covered in S3 gold-wrapped floral cloth, there were a few simple sets of food and 2 bowls of hot pea soup. Compared to the shockingly expensive oil paintings on the wall and the luxurious silver imperial-style tableware next to the food looked particularly shabby. President Pabre and Sulu sat at the 2 ends of the table. The 2 of them ate large mouthfuls of wheat bun without any manners and drank the pea soup that had been heated countless times. It had a strange smell of bacon. The waiter took away the cutlery. President Pabre said thank you, then patted his chest in satisfaction. He took a hot towel and wiped the corners of his eyes. He suddenly said, "What do you think?" The contrast between the white, scalding hot towel and Mr. President's tanned face was particularly stark. The sudden question seeped out from under the white, steaming towel, and the tone of the voice sounded a little strange. "Some thoughts, but I don't know if they are what you want." Sulu wiped his mouth with the hot towel and answered honestly, "The current situation is very good, very good." President Pabre put down the hot towel and looked at him from across the table. He said calmly, "But in reality, there is only a fine line between good and bad. Right now the government needs money, higher authority, more and more extensive support. The troops on the front lines need a stable and unshakable rear." President Pabal's gaze was very calm, and there was no pressure at all. However, for some reason, Sulu did not want to be looked at directly by him. He subconsciously lowered his head and looked at the hot towel in his hand, watching the steam slowly disperse. "The pressure on the government is great, the pressure on the military is great, and so is the pressure on me." President Pabre continued slowly. I don't know when the temporary military budget bill will be passed. If the front lines can't keep winning, if the resource recovery of the X3 system can't be accelerated, I really wonder if this government will go bankrupt. Of course, this is a joke. The president smiled, revealing a mouthful of bright white teeth. However, the wrinkles at the corners of his eyes showed that this joke actually made him very tired. Sulu held the hot towel tightly and felt the temperature disappear bit by bit. After a long silence, he finally said with difficulty, I understand, but just like what you said during the election, no choice can be made with the premise of harming the interests of others. President Pabre nodded and said calmly, I understand, but I have to remind you that the Federation's judicial process should not be interfered with. I have never thought about, nor do I have the ability to interfere with the Federation's judicial process. Sulu raised his head and explained seriously, I am a stakeholder, and I believe that Commander Zhong's daughter should have the right to take back what belongs to her. President Pabre looked at him with a serious expression and said in a deep voice, but you are not an ordinary person. Your words and actions will affect the views of many people, and even the judge's decision. You are not only a hero of the Federation that is deeply loved by the people, but you also represent the will of the Marshal to a certain extent, so you must be careful. After a moment of silence, Sulu lowered his head and replied, Schiller said that heroes also need to eat, clean their teeth, go to the bathroom and have sex. This is my right as a citizen, and I will not give it up. Chapter 687. Furthermore, for some reason, Sulu felt a little uneasy when he saw the tanned and tired middle-aged man sitting across the table. He thought about the things that had happened in the past few years and the wishes he had for the president. He raised his head and said stiffly, the one who really wants to influence the judicial process is someone else. It has nothing to do with me. President Pabre threw the cold, wet towel on the table and tried to suppress his anger. He criticized loudly, what is this? A voice of injustice? Do you think that I, or someone in the official residence, have exerted any pressure on the court? You didn't, but it doesn't mean that your subordinates didn't. Sulu thought of Director Breen's gloomy face in the shadows and the family representatives who listened in on the court. He continued to say unyieldingly, it doesn't mean that those families didn't. Otherwise, why would that curly-haired female judge make such a retarded judgment? He raised his head and looked at the slightly thin face of the president without flinching. He said in a deep voice, as for you and this official residence, silence is itself a kind of attitude. Silence was tacit agreement. Indifference was bystander. President Pabre and his official residence had remained silent on the affairs of the Westwoods for more than a year. They had not expressed any opinions on the trial. This was the best opinion for the sharks who were eating up the Zhong family's property in the Westwoods. However, this was the problem that Sulu found the most difficult to accept. The porcelain plates and silver forks on the table had long been cleaned up by the waiter. The lonely flame on the candlestick in the middle of the room danced in the dim room. There were some traces of soup on the gold-wrapped tablecloth. After hearing Sulu's courageous question, President Pabre kept staring at the stains and looking at them seriously. It was as if he was looking at his truest heart. Accompanied by the sound of the heavy wooden chair dragging on the bright brick floor, Mr. President stood up. He walked to the window and placed his hands behind his back. His tired and sore body leaned up slightly, leading his gaze to look through the glass at the falling snow under the illumination of the street lamps. He was silent for a long time. There is a very vulgar question. The president did not turn around and continued to stare at the scenery outside the window in a daze. He said, ever since I became the president of the Federation, all the scenery I've seen has been approved by the Special Task Force. Isn't this scenery, which has lost its taste of freedom, a nice scenery? Vaguely, Sulu caught a trace of his true thoughts from the slightly hoarse voice. He slowly stood up with his right hand holding the cold wet towel and looked at the thin middle-aged man by the window who still had extremely hard shoulders. There's a more vulgar way of asking. President Pabre's blurry face was reflected in the mirror. His lips twitched slightly as he said with a self-deprecating smile, are you one of my people? This question was indeed very vulgar. Whether it was the content of the question or the way it was asked, there was a sense of vulgarity. Probably only the worst gangsters in Donglin would use such a tone to recruit underlings. Who would have thought that the most powerful president of the Federation would not have the eloquent demeanor he had when he was a lawyer, and would just throw out such a vulgar sentence so harshly? So Sulu was stunned for a moment. After a while, he subconsciously narrowed his eyes and stood straight. He raised his right hand to the tip of his eyebrows and said in a deep voice, "As a soldier of the Federation, of course I will obey your orders." This should not be the answer that President Pabre wanted, but it was not the worst answer either. So, the president in the window smiled slightly and said slowly with deep emotions, "I'll say some words as one of my people. Regarding the lawsuit in Westwoods, I can understand your anger because many times I'm also very angry." President Pabre looked at himself in the window quietly, in the snow, in the light, and said in a low voice, "I'm angry because of my own shamelessness and despicableness. This shamelessness and despicableness is because I clearly realize that Commander Zhong's death is a very good thing for the Federation. I have to admit that whenever I think of this, I even feel very lucky." He slowly turned around. His deep eyes hid fatigue as he looked at Sulu and said slowly, "Sometimes in the middle of the night, I even think of something even crazier. If Commander Zhong the Tiger was still alive and still had dozens of powerful mechanics in his hands, insisting on not being the vanguard and only staying in the West Woods, coldly watching the federal forces invade the galaxy, would I have pushed the government and the military to use illegal means to kill him?" Sulu was silent. He knew very well what the Westwoods meant to the Federation's expedition. He also knew very well that what the president said was true. Commander Zhong's life was not good for the Federation, but his death could bring endless benefits to the Federation. In fact, the radical faction of the military and the important person in the government who created this conspiracy must have considered this as well. However, he had never imagined that Mr. President would actually admit that he had such thoughts. He raised his head in astonishment and looked at President Pable's silhouette by the window. He thought about the sincere care and protection that President Pable had given him all these years. He thought about how he had lamented earlier. Perhaps it was because Mr. President's silhouette by the window was too thin. He decided to say something. "I need a safe place." Sulu checked the password lock on the black workbench and suggested to President Pabre, "Otherwise, I wouldn't dare to say those things." President Pabre could not help but laugh. He waved his arm and said mockingly, "This is the official residence. Where can you find a safer place?" "I'm talking about information security," Sulu replied calmly. President Pabre frowned. His voice was deep and powerful. "Do you think someone dares to eavesdrop on me? It's not like this has never happened before in history." Sulu looked at him stubbornly. Holding the black workbench, he said, "Mr. President, you will find later that there is no one around you that you can trust." The president's dark cheeks appeared more and more solemn. He pressed the call button and ordered the relevant staff to prepare. While waiting, the first daughter, who had woken up in the middle of the night, rubbed her eyes and walked down the stairs. The girl, who had been fighting against the illness, was thin and weak and lovable. She gently hugged President Pabre. Then she noticed Sulu standing to the side. The girl's pair of indifferent eyes that made one's heart palpitate suddenly lit up, but in the end, she did not dare to go up and hug Sulu. She just lowered her head shyly and squatted a little. Then she covered her face and ran back to her bedroom. This somewhat cute scene would have been something that the president would tease or warn Sulu under normal circumstances. However, the atmosphere in the middle of the night was a little strange. There was only silence. The staff of the Special Task Force in black formal suits were like diligent worker ants that did not need to sleep. They cleared the path as quickly as possible. Then they protected the president and Sulu as they walked into the emergency tunnel under the official residence. After walking for about 10 minutes, the stairs gradually extended upward. They should have entered a building. "What is this place?" Sulu looked at the big iron door in confusion and asked, "Are you sure it is safer than the official residence?" "This is the Ministry of Finance's fully blocked bond database." President Pabre turned to look at him with a smile and said, "Young man, welcome to visit the Federation government's treasure vault. At this time, the senior director of the Special Task Force said with a serious expression, "Mr. President, I strongly object to you and Colonel Sulu entering the vault alone. This is a serious violation of the relevant regulations." The senior director looked at Sulu indifferently. His eyes were as sharp as an eagle's. "Colonel Sulu, I think you should understand the importance of discipline." Sulu did not answer. "Don't worry about anything. Colonel Sulu is the person I trust the most." The president patted the shoulder of the senior director with a smile and said, "If even he wants to kill me, maybe it means that I really should be dead." Haha, this became a famous saying in the future. That is my report. There must be something wrong with the attack on the ancient bell. But the most urgent problem now is that you can't trust the people around you, Mr. President. It will be easy for big problems to happen. The fully blocked database deep underground was in accordance with the usual extravagant style of the Ministry of Finance. There were as many as 7 security clearance scans outside the vault. Sulu followed President Pabre into the vault, but found that it was empty. There were only a few cold computers running silently for a long time. So Sulu's last sentence reverberated several times before it gradually subsided. President Pabre had been quietly staring at the light screen on the workbench, as if he wanted to burn through the list and inference on the light screen. After hearing Sulu's words, he got up and walked to the wall full of dean vines. He stretched out 2 fingers with his right hand and said in a hoarse voice, "Please give me a cigarette." Sulu took out a 37 brand cigarette, put it between Mr. President's fingers, and then lit it. President Pabre took a deep breath of the cigarette and choked on it. Suddenly, he roared angrily at the wall full of dean vines, like an enraged lion, using the most vicious words and the most dangerous posture to announce his uncontrollable anger. He turned around abruptly, stared into Sulu's eyes, and shouted hoarsely, "You want me to believe that my vice president and so many pillars of the Federation are a bunch of murderers who have committed all kinds of crimes? Evidence, you must show me evidence." "Evidence can be found through investigation." Sulu replied in a low voice, "I know that it is very inappropriate to investigate the attack on the ancient bell, but I can investigate in secret. I need the authorization of the Ministry of Justice." President Pabre threw the cigarette to the ground. The expression on his face was very complicated. There was sadness and anger mixed with some indescribable emotions. He said slowly, "If you don't have the authorization, you won't investigate? With or without authorization, I will investigate." Sulu replied. President Pabre slowly raised his head and looked at the face of the young officer in front of him. After a long silence, he said firmly, "Then investigate." The federal forces on the plains had lost their highest commander, and even their most crucial morale had taken a huge hit. Faced with the iron tide of hundreds of Empire's Wolfang mecha surging out from the cities, the federal forces began to tremble, especially when they later found out that the mecha covered in broken metal boxes and silently standing on the hill with a spear in hand was that legendary Empire princess. This was a tragic surface battle. The Empire used a large amount of blood and cruel images to announce to the Federal Army that their bottom line was here. The Empire's princess, Hui Chaoshi, did not hesitate to take the risk and stand on the battlefield as a noble figure to kill the enemy and avoid them because she wanted to let the Federation know clearly that her father would not take another step back. This battle on the plains, other than being bloody and tragic, was also recorded in the history of human wars for another reason. This was because this was the first pure mecha battle in the universe after the Federation was equipped with the MX mecha, and the Empire was equipped with the Wolfang mecha. All over the mountains and plains, high-speed whistling, the cold, tall, and highly mobile mecha completely ignored the supporting artillery fire from both sides. They charged, crashed, fell, and crawled back up. The deafening sound of metal, flying rocks, and mechanical limbs. No sound could be louder. No momentum could suppress the simultaneous charge of hundreds of ferocious alloy mecha. At that moment, the entire surface was trembling in fear. Faced with the Empire's long-prepared and vicious counterattack, faced with that Her Royal Highness the Princess who was as strong as the sun and moon, faced with those high-speed and mobile Wolfang mecha, faced with the strategic bottom line that the Empire's people were determined to protect even at the cost of their lives, the Fourth Field Army who had committed the mistake of recklessness paid an extremely heavy price. After 3 brief charges and a cleansing, the Federation's position was already a tragic sight to behold. Countless large holes had been blasted through the defensive cluster formation, the corpses of Federation soldiers flying everywhere. If the situation on the battlefield had continued to develop, perhaps the Fourth Field Army really could have become the first army to be completely wiped out in the war. Fortunately, at the most dangerous moment, the 38th Division of the West Woods Military District made a risky and sudden landing on the back of the planet. Among the first batch of mecha troops to make the sudden landing was Colonel Li Feng, who had just rushed over from the capital ring after surrendering himself, and his specially made MXT mecha from the Nutshell shell. Without rest, Madman Li drove the black MXT indifferently and violently, leaping into the battlefield, leaping into the midst of the iron flow of mecha, towards the Peach Miasma mecha. The late winter of year 71 of the Federation's standard constitutional calendar was a winter of victory for many people. The successive victories of the troops at the front lines spurred the citizens of the capital ring into one after another celebration after another. The commander who sacrificed himself at the front lines received an honor that he shouldn't have after his death. The citizens of the Federation only knew that both sides had temporarily maintained a balanced situation at the outskirts of the X3 system. However, they didn't know that in order to protect the frontline troops from the few administrative planets at the edge of L9, the Federation's frontline headquarters had put in a lot of effort, and how much blood and sweat Colonel Li Feng had sacrificed in order to fight against the powerful Peach Miasma mecha. Su Lu, who had obtained the authorization of the Ministry of Justice and the secret support of the President, seemed to be gaining victory after victory within the Federation. Through investigating the military prison and collecting analysis materials on the wreckage of the ancient bell from the Research Institute, he had obtained more evidence. He was very clear that in the special context of war, any investigation had to be done carefully, especially to not affect the overall morale of the Federation. Therefore, his investigation was carried out in a very low-key manner, trying not to attract the attention of those big shots. Now it seemed that his efforts had some effect, and until now, he hadn't met with any resistance. The Westwoods family property lawsuit was also slowly but firmly moving forward according to the procedures. Su Lu, who had become the legal guardian of the little princess of the Zhong family, was naturally forced to attend many court hearings, and today was no doubt the most important one, because according to the procedures, the one presiding over the hearing today was the Federation's Chief Justice He Ying. There were still more than 10 days before the new year, and the snow in the capital's special district was getting more and more intense. Not far from the square, there were still traces of electronic fireworks, which should be the result of the citizens celebrating the victory at the front lines last night. Sitting in the back row, Su Lu narrowed his eyes and looked at the burn marks on the snow through the window. His left hand held onto little Watermelon's slightly cold hand, and after a moment of silence he said in court later, "No matter what the Chief Justice asks, just answer according to your true thoughts." Okay. Zhong Huiyan, who was not yet a teenager, but had a childish look that could be described as childish beauty, hugged the old doll tightly with her left hand and squeezed out a sound from her slightly raised little nose. She looked at the monotonous snowy scenery outside the window and couldn't help but pout. She missed the beach a little, so she lowered her head and said softly, "Brother Su Lu, I miss home." Her delicate and childish voice seeped out from between her neat black bangs, as moving as the rain brushed by the strings of a zither. Su Lu was slightly stunned, and said with a smile, "Actually, you've been in the capital ring for a little longer." Zhong Huiyan raised her head and looked seriously into Su Li's eyes. She said, "But I'm still from the Westwoods after all, right?" Su Lu paused for a moment and nodded. Looking at the old doll under her left armpit, he asked doubtfully, "Is this the doll you had when you ran away from home?" "Yes." Zhong Huiyan lowered her head and was silent for a long time. Then she suddenly replied, "I won't run away anymore because my parents are no longer here. Don't worry." Su Lu turned sideways and narrowed his eyes at the dry snowy scenery outside the window. He looked at the approaching Supreme Court of the Federation in silence. According to the complicated and troublesome judicial process of the Federation, Especially when the case involves such a terrifying object as the Zhong family's property in the West Woods, the court trial would naturally evolve into a long and drawn-out drama. Therefore, Sulu knew very well that today's court hearing was more of an announcement that the family property case had entered a new stage, and there would definitely be no conclusion. Therefore, he was not very nervous, but he couldn't help but be a little curious about the old judge who was about to appear. The only position in the Federation's power structure that was subject to tenure was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the Federation. Without the approval of 4/5 of the members of the Management Committee, the President could not nominate or dismiss the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. When Judge He-Ying was 42 years old, he was nominated by the President of the time to be the Supreme Court of the Federation. This also meant that he, who was now 90 years old, had already been in this position for 50 years. What did 50 years mean? 9 presidents came and went like a merry-go-round. 2,000 members of parliament crawled in and out of the mountain that was full of ant nests. The leaders of the 7 major families changed 1 or 2 batches, and Li Pifu went from an ordinary military officer to the Federation's god of war. And Judge He-Ying was still, had always been, and seemed to always be the Supreme Court of the Federation. This was very scary, or rather very worthy of respect. Chapter 689. There was a saying in the Federation, "Man cannot fight against time." This saying seemed so simple and clear, but when one thought about it carefully, it could easily make people feel sad and even tragic. Whether it was the unparalleled hero who sailed a battleship through the colorful clouds and returned home, or the poor people who struggled to find shellfish in the black mud, they were all equal and equally helpless in the face of time. You could shout to the red morning sun, "I am the sun. Even if I sink, I will still rise tomorrow." But in fact, there would always be a day when your sun would never rise again after it had sunk. Therefore, for those who could temporarily fight against time, even if it was a tie on the surface, people would always treat them with sincere respect and courtesy, such as the old man who was slowly walking into the court with a bent body. For half a century, this old man had been sitting on the Chief Justice's high-backed black rubber chair as usual, as if he was sitting on his own sofa, watching the start and end of countless important cases that shook the Federation or became cited cases. When the people in the court saw the old judge who was resting with his eyes closed, they subconsciously lowered their voices, and even moved their feet more gently, as if they were worried that they would wake the old man up. Chief Justice He-Ying, the lifelong Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the Federation, turned out to be such an old man with age spots all over his face, who was so tired that he seemed like he could fall asleep and die at any moment. Looking at the old man, Su Li's mood was a bit strange, and his eyes gradually narrowed. He thought of the feeling he had when he first saw military god Li Pifu in the military prison of Qingcheng. At that time in his eyes, Li Pifu was just an ordinary thin old man when he was not angry and silent. But the Chief Justice in the court, who had once embarrassed military god old man, seemed to be an ordinary old man when he was asleep or awake. Immediately, Sulu knew that his judgment was completely wrong. Zhong Ziqi's team of lawyers requested for the final confirmation of custody. Judge He-Ying slowly opened his turbid eyes with great difficulty. Looking at the adorable little girl in front of him, his drooping lips suddenly twitched nervously. After a moment, he asked in a hoarse and gentle voice, "Little girl, who do you like to live with?" The chief judge's voice was old to the extreme, but gentle to the extreme. It seemed that in the eyes of this old man, Zhong Huoyan was like a newly born lotus, on which there were dewdrops that had condensed last night. If the voice was slightly louder, the rolling dewdrops would be frightened and fall into the pond, disappearing forever. Sulu was stunned, and so was Zhong Huoyan. After a long while, the little girl tilted her head and looked up in disbelief. She hugged the old doll tightly and said in a low voice, "I want to live with Brother Sulu." Judge He-Ying was comforted by her words. He chuckled hoarsely, moved his arm with difficulty, and signed his twisted name on the electronic judgment. Then he said with a smile, "Little girl, you can live with whoever you want." At this moment, Sulu looked at the old chief judge in the court and couldn't help but think of many years ago, the same chief judge, who might have used the same tone to ask Jian Shuier, who had just become a little girl, Do you like to act in TV shows? At the same time, he finally understood what Taizion said by the railing. The old chief judge likes little girls. Far away in the left sky galaxy, in the periphery of the Gamma galaxy, which was not far from the X3 galaxy, the battleships of the Federation had already appeared. Especially in the space near the three mineral stars, there were large transport ships moving back and forth from time to time. In the middle of the big pit, the ore segment analyzer with sophisticated electronic equipment was working, waiting for the mining and sorting process that was about to come. The crystal mine engineers, who were wearing equipment similar to that of the individual soldiers of the Federation, stood on the engineering corridor that was almost 30 meters high and looked down at the engineering mechas working below. Because of the low temperature, traces of dry ice had already formed on their half-mirrored helmets. Outside the busy mining site, bypassing a rock peak and passing through a rugged landscape, there was a metal spaceship that had been burnt into black charcoal, enjoying the loneliness by itself. This was a tri-wing spaceship of the Bureau of Proclamation that should have been placed in a history museum. However, because it was too damaged, it could only stay in a corner that was forgotten by the federal military like a black stone. However, the tri-wing spaceship was not lonely today. Chaotic electronic noises were faintly echoing in the seemingly empty and chaotic cabin. Behind the tri-wing spaceship, a self-propelled mecha of the Federation of Crystal Mines had been miserably disassembled. Some of the important components on it had disappeared without a trace. The tri-wing spaceship that looked like a black stone slowly retracted its hydraulic maintenance arm. A dot of light appeared on the light beam that was full of dust. Then it turned into a row of white symbols of light. If Sulu were here, he would definitely be very familiar with these symbols of light, because he often saw them in his eyes. It was a kind of self-examination or self-questioning. The white symbols of light flashed non-stop, as if they were ignoring the environment of the surrounding barren planet and the passage of time. For that great mechanical intelligence, time seemed to be the only enemy that he needed to defeat. After a certain period of time, the tri-wing spaceship of the Bureau of Proclamation that looked like a black stone took off silently. Then it flew into the depths of the universe, its destination unknown. The verdict is very clear. There shouldn't be any problems with the Gu Clock Company. It's just that the Zhong family still has a lot of hidden properties. The ownership of those properties is too troublesome and difficult to sort out. As for the military, it's also an extremely troublesome matter. In my opinion, these things shouldn't be touched at all, but Uncle Tian isn't willing to accept it. No one can accept it. If the old house of the Zhong family doesn't have any soldiers in its hands, then it will really become a little white rabbit that is at the mercy of others. However, to be able to take back the Gu Clock Company is already a very great victory. If such a giant company is really in turmoil, it will also be troublesome for the Federation. After all, the metal ball-like forward base in front of the Night Scorpion Nebula and the newest floating feather warship, the Gu Clock Company contributed a lot. The Supreme Court's verdict must have been unexpected to many people. What was unexpected was the speed of Justice He Ying's verdict. Who would have thought that this old man actually only used 10 minutes to make a decision? The justice is really a great person. Although the way he smiled at the little girl was indeed a bit wretched. Sulu smiled somewhat helplessly. He took off the cigarette and lightly flicked a third of the way, letting the ashes flutter freely in the spring wind, and then slowly fell on a grave. Shi Qinghai, wearing sunglasses, silently looked at the grave in front of him for a long time. He took out the cigarette from his mouth and fiercely stuffed it into the wet soil in front of the tombstone, cursing a few words in a low voice. "What did you say?" Sulu asked. Shi Qinghai shrugged, squinting his eyes, and said, "Such a great guy, but in the end he died because of the most tacky liver cancer. What a boring thing." The two of them were now in an ordinary cemetery on the outskirts of S2's Oak State. S1 was late winter, S2 was late spring, and the spring wind was intoxicating. The last time they came to this planet together, it was to assassinate Macklin. At that time, the person responsible for providing them with information was already lying in a cement-lined grave. No matter how beautiful the spring wind was, it couldn't brush his body. The age of the dead man in the grave was unknown, and they didn't know his background. Even the senior leaders of the Green Dragon Mountain anti-government army didn't know how many faces this good teacher and helpful friend had. I heard that when he died, the leader of Nanshui cried. Shi Qinghai lit another cigarette and said mockingly, "Bah! When those old dogs in the committee were messing with him, did the leader of Nanshui say a word for his close comrade?" He looked at the cold grave, his eyes somewhat red. After a moment of silence, he suddenly opened his mouth and said, "Old dog, do you regret it? The people who fought against time were all dead. The people who fought against windmills were all dead." The most outstanding intelligence leader of the Green Dragon Mountain anti-government army, the most outstanding spy of the Federation's 37 constitutionals, had quietly died like this. He who was codenamed him had died like this. It seemed that he didn't bring any shock to this world. The Green Dragon Mountain Committee issued an obituary, and the Federation's Ministry of Justice revoked 17 arrest warrants. 2 equally outstanding juniors came to his grave and painfully questioned him a few times. The hymn in the grave was already unable to answer. Only the words engraved on the tombstone quietly agreed. "If one day I suddenly leave, please bury me in the spring." Chapter 690. It was spring now, and he was buried in a tomb that was gently caressed by the spring breeze. A few years ago, he knew his final fate, and had done his best to arrange for his funeral. Perhaps this was the only way he could lie so calmly on the ground and rest to his heart's content. We don't even know his name yet. Sulu held the cigarette in his mouth and sucked hard. He frowned as he thought about the troubles that the wretched uncle in the grave had brought him, and all the joys and sorrows. He couldn't help but sigh. Although those who are good at fighting are not famous, and those who are really fierce often don't have names, once you think about how to mention him in the history books, it always feels weird. He is the third son of the Chao family, called Chao Chiu Dao. The remote and secluded cemetery in Oak State was particularly lively today. An extremely old lady with heavy makeup and a red fox fur draped over her shoulders walked out from under the ginkgo tree. Her face was expressionless, and her eyes were full of indifference and loneliness. This lady was called Sister Ku, and she was one of the living legends in the 4 states around the mountains of S2. She only owned Coco nightclub, but this nightclub had endured the sound of gunfire and smoke for too long. As mentioned before, those who dared to fight against time were always easily revered, and she was also one of them. "Hello, Sister Ku." Sulu and Shi Qinghai stood up at the same time, threw away the cigarettes in their hands, and slightly bowed to greet her. For them, showing respect to this old lady was not because of some legend, but because of the relationship between this lady and the man in the grave. Many years ago, this relationship between a young student who was determined to join the revolution and a popular girl in a nightclub gradually evolved into a relationship between a revolutionary leader and an old lady that he didn't want to forget. This relationship was the real legend. Sister Ku, who was already an old lady, slowly walked to the grave. Looking at the words on the tombstone, she shook her head and said in a lonely voice, "I heard him say that he once formed a poetry club in school, but eventually he got tired of it." Sulu and Shi Qinghai looked at Sister Ku, not knowing what to say. Zhang Xiaoming came yesterday. Sister Ku turned around and coughed twice. She looked at Sulu and said calmly, "She is his student. As for hiding the news of his death, it was his idea. Don't blame that poor girl." "Understood," Sulu answered succinctly. In a corner of Oak State's most famous rock bar, Sulu and Shi Qinghai were drinking the local specialty high malt honey beer. In their eyes, there seemed to be the image of the old lady standing alone and calmly by the grave in the glass full of bright yellow liquor. Only today did they find out that the intelligence leader of Green Dragon Mountain, the one who gave the Federation government headaches for several decades, the one who was determined to lead the anti-government army to overthrow the government and the 7 great families, was actually a descendant of one of the 7 great families, the Chao family. At this moment, Sulu thought of Shangqiu's fiancé and Uncle Tian. He said with emotion, "They say that Lin Banshan is the most outstanding rebel of the 7 great families. But compared to the Chao Chiu Dao in the grave, he is still too far away. As a descendant of the 7 great families, he had dedicated his life to the cause of destroying the 7 great families. The Chao Chou Dao in the grave could be called a real rebel, a young college student who ran away because of an arranged marriage. In the end, he ran away and became one of the leaders of the anti-government army. I don't know if he regretted it or not. No one knows. When he was alive, he could make the world dance. When he died, he could make a woman stand silently by the grave. Shi Qinghai drank the beer in his cup in one gulp. He wiped the foam on his lips and praised. The old man's life was so fucking awesome, too powerful. Sulu raised his full cup of beer, shrugged and drank a big gulp. Last time we came to S2 together, we went to the Golden Foundation building to kill Macklin. Chao Chou Dao didn't tell us the whole plan. We were just the executors. Fortunately, there weren't too many mistakes in the end. Shi Qinghai said, at that time in Coco nightclub, I kept guessing what role Coco played. Unfortunately, until today, I haven't gotten an answer. Was it love between them? Shi Qinghai's charming peach blossom eyes slightly squinted. His slender fingers gently tapped on the empty cup of beer, making a crisp and pleasant sound. I always thought that I loved Zoyu or could love her. But today, beside the grave, I suddenly thought of another girl, the girl from the beautiful island. Who? Sulu asked in confusion. That was a beautiful girl I met before killing Macklin. Shi Qinghai squeezed his handsome eyebrows, as if he couldn't remember the girl's appearance and name. She seemed to be a teacher, but I can't remember where she was from. I even forgot her name. Trash. Sulu gave him a man's evaluation without holding back. Speaking of trash, how are you going to deal with the trash in the government? Shi Qinghai asked. Don't worry, Sulu replied. The old man said that these people will walk into the trash heap of history. Shi Qinghai was silent for a moment, then continued with a smile. But Schiller said that trash never walks into the trash by itself. Sulu shrugged, stared at the beer cup in his hand, watched the tiny bubbles struggle to rise in the golden beer, and then burst into fine white bubbles. He suddenly said, anyway, this is my job. I specifically told Zoyu last time, but I forgot about it and gave you the list. Because you needed my help. I don't need it now. Then I wish you good luck. Shi Qinghai looked at the beautiful girl walking from the side of the bar, who was looking for a target. He smiled and patted Su Li's shoulder, and said, I hope you didn't sacrifice yourself for the country, but end up being the victim of a crime of passion. Su Lu watched him put away the iron box 37 into his pocket. He subconsciously turned around, and happened to meet Nan Xiangmei's gentle eyes. You're here? I'm here. Want some beer? Yes. Nan Xiangmei sat next to him obediently, her hands on her legs, slightly lowered her head and shyly nodded. Sulu began to pour beer for her. There was a bottle of beer in the special slender open cup. He watched the fine bubbles rise, but Nan Xiangmei didn't ask him to stop. It's not far, right? Can you get used to living in S2? He finally stopped pouring beer, and asked a little uncomfortably. Nan Xiangmei looked up, lifted the trembling bangs on her forehead, and said with a gentle smile, the foundation is next door, so it's really convenient to meet here. Sulu was stunned and asked in disbelief, the Reconstruction Foundation and the Medellin Peace Foundation use the same building? Yes. Nan Xiangmei took the tissue from the waiter, carefully wiped the beer stains on the table in front of Sulu, and said softly, but can we not talk about this issue? Of course. I know why you asked me out today. Nan Xiangmei looked at Sulu with a smile, and the firm look on her face, contrasted by the alcohol, made her look like a child. But I don't want to promise you anything. Sulu opened his mouth slightly, thinking that he hadn't said anything yet. Nan Xiangmei used both of her hands to hold the heavy, slender, open-mouthed beer mug and began to drink in big gulps. She raised her left arm to wipe off the foam on her lips and let out a satisfied sigh. Then she turned her head and looked at him seriously, saying, Jian Shuai is not bad, but she's not as suitable as me to be a wife. She squeezed out a syllable with her nose, as if to strengthen her confidence, or to cheer herself up. Well, it's like this, she's not as suitable as me to be a wife. After mustering up all her courage to say this sentence, Nan Xiangmei immediately relaxed completely. With a smile, she called the bartender for 2 more bottles of beer. She didn't care that her jade-like white cheeks were already flushed red. Where did this come from? Although the purpose of meeting with Nan Xiangmei today was indeed to clarify this matter, but Sulu didn't expect that as soon as they met, before he had time to say anything, he would be called back by a serious topic about a wife's job. Sulu actually liked this gentle and beautiful girl very much, but this kind of liking was more of a sense of peace and rest. In fact, he didn't have much contact with this girl, and they couldn't even be considered friends. After all, these years of life were too difficult. Nan Xiangmei could watch the documentary Group 7 to search for him, but he didn't have time to let the girl on the train ferment in his mind. However, he really liked her. Sulu stared at the beer in the cup, not daring to look away. The feelings between men and women are always so complicated. Especially when you meet the most beautiful opposite sex in the world. What choice can you make? These are all very, very good and also what I want. Suddenly, he thought of something and asked Nan Xiangmei, "Do you have any relatives in your mother's family?" "You mean the Chow family?" Nan Xiangmei, who was a little drunk, looked at Sulu with a smile. She raised her finger and said, "I have many uncles." Sulu suddenly found that the opposite sex he provoked seemed to be very difficult to provoke. If those uncles with the surname Chow were like the one lying in the grave, it would be very difficult for him to live a very comfortable life. "Have you heard of Chow Chodao? It seems to be third uncle." Nan Xiangmei slightly tilted her head and cutely thought, "He is much older than mother. I heard that he died a long time ago. I'll take you to a place." Okay. In the end, Sulu didn't take Nan Xiangmei to the grave of her unknown uncle, because when he walked out of this famous bar, he saw 3 black SUVs, and then more than a dozen Federation Bureau of Investigation agents in black formal suits surrounding them. "Colonel Sulu, please come with us." In the dim background, a big shot from the military said after a moment of silence, "Commander Xiaoqing and his Iron 7th Division have been fighting for more than 3 years. They should be back for rotation rest." Hearing this proposal, Vice President Byron fell into silence. He seemed to be considering what kind of influence the undefeatable army would bring to the political situation in the future once they returned to the capital ring. A moment later he made up his mind. A smile appeared on his face that didn't have too many wrinkles because of his weight. He slowly said, "I support this proposal." They also support this proposal. It seemed that the participants of the secret meeting in the dim light all knew who the vice president was talking about. There was a brief whisper in the small conference room, and the atmosphere seemed to be much more relaxed. "There is one more thing that I need to inform you." Vice President Byron held a gold pen and lightly tapped the base of the loudspeaker. He frowned and said, "Half an hour ago, the Federation Investigation Bureau has taken Sulu away to assist in the investigation." The whispers in the small conference room suddenly disappeared without a trace. It was so quiet that it made people's heart palpitate. These big shots who had the guts to secretly influence the Federation's progress and use the most despicable means to construct countless conspiracies were, for many reasons, extremely afraid of the Federation officer named Sulu. When they found that they were finally about to launch an attack on Colonel Sulu, they were actually speechless for a moment. Vice President Byron slightly frowned, glanced at the crowd and said indifferently, "We have the most reliable evidence and the most direct witnesses. If Colonel Sulu is really a wanted criminal of the Federation, then he must be investigated. This, even the Marshal won't have any objections." In the snowy Macho Back Mountain, the top layer of the clear lake was frozen by the cold. The bright thin ice cracked and twisted under the afternoon sun, making people's vision feel a little turbid. It was just like the situation in the capital that was gradually becoming chaotic because of the fast transmission of the news at this moment. After Judge Heing made the judgment in the Supreme Court, the government and those families will definitely be very angry. Although this judgment only involves the Gu Clock Company and doesn't talk about more interests, they still took action immediately. Especially the investigation of the Federation Investigation Bureau. which is still beyond many people's expectation. The most incomprehensible thing is, according to the analysis of the Foundation's research lab, this kind of investigation can't cause any harm to Colonel Sulu, except to make Old Master Feiqing and the president angrier. Secretary Shunli quietly stood behind the high-backed chair. The sun passed through the remaining snow on the balcony and sprinkled on his head and shoulders, giving off a somewhat mottled and unclear feeling. Sitting on the high-backed chair, Lady Tai's eyes were gentle and soft, quietly looking at the snowy landscape outside the balcony. With the Federal Force's successive victories, the Tai family's Crystal Mine Alliance was reborn. Countless wealth and the more important resource control system were poured back into this old Thousand family that was about to decay. The current situation was undoubtedly a reward for the Federation government's unstinting support over the past few decades, as well as an extremely high reward for her political wisdom. However, for some reason it seemed that the lady didn't care about this at all. Instead, there was a faint trace of worry between her eyebrows. The highest level of political struggle and the lowest level of street brawl, in fact, there is no difference in essence. The biggest hatred is just to cut off someone's path to wealth and take away someone's wife and daughter. Lady Tai held the slightly hot ginger teacup and said thoughtfully, Sulu, with the glory of the Federation's hero, against the two mountains of Old Master and Mr. Pabre, he interfered without any scruples, making everyone unable to enjoy the big cake that is the Zhong family. It's like a bone is stuck in their throat. This is cutting off someone's path to wealth. He is used to being impulsive without considering the overall situation. Naturally, he doesn't care about how many people's interests are harmed. Last time when he killed Macklin, if Macklin wasn't a spy of the Empire, then neither the President nor Old Master would have been able to protect him. Lady Tai took a sip of the ginger tea and said, the public anger, the simple word public can explain everything. I just don't understand now. Sulu is a smooth stone, and those people can't plant moss on this stone under the current situation. The President is watching, Philadelphia is watching, and the people are watching. Then what is the Federation Investigation Bureau trying to find out? What can they find out? The worry between the madam's eyebrows became more and more obvious. She had been watching the commotion in the Federation with cold eyes. After discovering that the radicals were somewhat difficult to control, she even directly used Sulu as a counterweight. That was because she believed that she had the only weakness that could be used against Sulu. Behind Old Master, she was probably the only person in the Federation who could control that disobedient little guy. The current situation seemed to be a bit strange. Secretary Shin stood silently behind her and said softly, it's definitely not an internal matter of the military, so it could only be something that happened a long time ago. Lady Tai's thin eyebrows slightly furrowed. She vaguely guessed a certain possibility. The problem was that Su Li's true identity was only known to her and army god Li Pifu. How did those people know this secret? Are they going to turn the Federation hero back into a wanted criminal? The residual snow filtered the light. Between heaven and earth, it was uncertain whether it was clear or not. You're tuning in to the Li Mei's Wuxia Whispers YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.